My sister booked her extravagant wedding on my exact date just to prove she was the golden child. The night before the ceremony, her luxury venue flooded under very questionable circumstances. Her 300 VIP guests arrived at the only other secured hall in town, which happened to be mine, expecting to see her walk down the aisle. But when the grand oak doors opened, the bride standing under the spotlight was not her. And the financial presentation I projected behind the altar sent her new husband straight into federal handcuffs. I am Harper, 32 years old, and a crisis communications manager who spends her days burying scandals for corporate executives. When my family tried to crush my milestone to elevate my sister, I simply smiled and handed them the shovels. Before I tell you how I dismantled a Ponzi scheme in a wedding dress, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you know that standing up to toxic blood relatives requires a spine of steel. My finger hovered over the trackpad before pressing send on my digital save-the-date invitations. September 14th. Julian and I had chosen the date specifically because it marked the anniversary of the day we met. Julian is a quiet, brilliant cybersecurity architect who prefers writing code in the shadows rather than standing in the spotlight. I prefer handling public relations disasters behind the scenes. We wanted an elegant, understated autumn wedding. Exactly 3 minutes after my emails went out, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed my mother, Patricia. I answered, expecting a generic congratulations. Instead, her voice came through the speaker tight and clipped, carrying the familiar tone of a woman issuing a boardroom directive rather than speaking to her daughter. "You need to recall those invitations, Harper." Patricia dictated, not bothering to say hello. "You are moving your date. It conflicts with your sister." I glanced across our kitchen island at Julian, who lowered his coffee mug, his dark eyes narrowing. I put the phone on speaker. "What are you talking about, Mom?" I asked, keeping my tone level. Julian and I locked this date in 6 months ago. A notification banner slid across my tablet screen. It was an Instagram alert. Chloe, my younger sister, had just posted a lavish, highly produced engagement video. The caption read, "The social event of the season is coming. Save the date for September 14th. Chloe had been engaged to Marcus for barely a month. Marcus was an African-American real estate developer who drove a leased sports car, wore suits that shined a bit too much under the light, and spoke loudly about his vast property portfolios. He loved being the center of attention, a trait that made him and Chloe a match made in narcissistic heaven. Chloe just announced her date. Patricia continued, her tone brokering no argument. Marcus requires a high-profile networking event to secure overseas investors for his next high-rise project. Their wedding is the business face of this family right now. You having a competing event on the exact same day is a distraction we cannot afford. You will move yours to November." I clicked on Chloe's digital invitation. My stomach tightened. It was not just the same date. The location, listed in elegant gold font, was the historic Botanical Conservatory downtown. That was my venue, the exact venue I had put a deposit on months prior. "Mom," I said, leaning forward. "She booked the conservatory. That is my venue." "Marcus paid them triple your deposit to buy out the contract," Patricia stated, devoid of any maternal warmth. "Money talks, Harper. You should know that in your line of work. He needs the aesthetic of that specific hall to impress his international partners. You and Julian prefer simple things anyway. Call your guests and issue a retraction. Do not make this a scene." She expected me to yell. She expected the lifelong dynamic where I fought for scraps of her approval, while Chloe paraded around with the entire pie. I looked at Julian. I was already typing on his laptop, his fingers flying across the keys with lethal speed. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply pressed the end call button, cutting my mother off mid-sentence. Julian did not look up from his screen. He bypassed standard search engines, digging straight into public financial filings and commercial credit registries. People who throw cash around to steal wedding venues usually have something to hide. Julian murmured, his eyes reflecting the harsh blue light of the monitor. "Let us see how deep Marcus really goes." A few seconds later, Julian stopped typing. He turned the laptop toward me. The screen displayed a labyrinth of staggering commercial loan defaults and severe credit warnings. Marcus was not a thriving real estate mogul. He was drowning in high-interest debt, and the balloon payments were due in mere weeks. The extravagant wedding was not a celebration. It was a desperate, flashy mirage designed to lure new investors into a sinking ship. My family thought they had sidelined me. They had no idea they just handed a crisis manager the exact blueprints to their impending ruin. The morning sun barely crested the skyline when my cell phone vibrated against the marble counter. The caller identification showed the Botanical Conservatory. I answered on the first ring. The events director, a usually confident woman named Sarah, spoke with a noticeable tremor in her voice. She stumbled over her words, offering a profuse string of apologies and mentioning a breach of contract compensation clause. Marcus had cornered the venue owners late last night. He bypassed the standard booking office and went straight to the property management board, wielding a combination of heavy cash incentives and veiled threats about pulling future corporate galas. I effectively bullied them into revoking my reservation. Sarah sounded close to tears as she explained that my deposit was being refunded in full, along with a penalty fee. He wanted me stranded. The strategy was painfully transparent. By stripping away my venue just months before the date, Marcus and my family expected me to fold. They assumed the logistical nightmare of finding a replacement location on such short notice would force me to postpone. I would be left with no choice but to attend Chloe's extravagant affair, dutifully playing the role of the defeated older sister fading into the background of her photographs. I thanked Sarah for her honesty and ended the call. They expected tears. They anticipated a frantic, hysterical bride scrambling through directory listings and begging banquet halls for a cancellation slot. They fundamentally misunderstood how I operate. In the high-stakes world of crisis communications, a sudden structural collapse is just another Tuesday. When a Fortune 500 chief executive officer faces an impending media disaster, I do not panic. I leverage relationships. I picked up my phone and dialed a private number I reserved for top-tier emergencies. It belonged to Elias, a tech billionaire, whose legacy I had salvaged 2 years prior when a vicious corporate espionage scandal threatened to tank his initial public offering. I navigated the fallout, controlled the press, and saved his firm billions. He owed me a favor. Elias answered immediately. I skipped the pleasantries and outlined my logistical predicament. I needed a secured location impervious to outside financial influence available on September 14th. Elias chuckled, a rich sound of amusement. He offered me the keys to his private estate located in the secluded hills outside the city. It was an architectural marvel featuring sprawling manicured gardens, a glass-enclosed atrium, and a security perimeter designed to keep roaming paparazzi at bay. It was a venue that no amount of flashy cash could ever rent because it was strictly not for sale. It operated on a currency of loyalty and exclusive access. I accepted the offer. Within an hour, my wedding was not just salvaged, it was elevated to a tier of luxury that Marcus could never comprehend. I kept the new location strictly confidential. As far as my family knew, I was currently a bride without a venue drowning in logistical despair. Let them enjoy their false victory. While I secured our new fortress, Julian remained seated at our kitchen island, his eyes tracking lines of code reflecting off his glasses. Marcus, throwing triple the deposit in pure cash to hijack a botanical garden, did not sit right with him. Wealthy developers leverage corporate credit or utilize vendor partnerships. They rarely drop duffel bags of liquid cash to bully a wedding planner unless they are attempting to project a dangerous illusion of liquidity. Julian tapped a sequence of keys, diving past the superficial search results. As a cybersecurity architect, he spent his days building impenetrable digital walls to protect financial institutions. He knew exactly how to dismantle the flimsy public facades people constructed online. He started with the corporate registries. Marcus flaunted a portfolio of commercial properties on his social media, posing in front of high-rise developments and tagging his holding company. Julian pulled the public deeds for those specific addresses. The search query loaded in seconds, revealing the stark, undeniable truth. Marcus did not own a single one of those buildings. He was merely a minority stakeholder in a sprawling network of limited liability companies, most of which were currently embroiled in messy litigation over unpaid contractor invoices. Julian dug deeper, accessing commercial credit databases and legal dockets. The polished image of the wealthy real estate tycoon rapidly disintegrated into a mosaic of severe financial distress. Marcus was drowning. He had secured numerous short-term high-yield loans from predatory private lenders. These were not standard mortgages. They were punishing agreements designed for desperate borrowers, carrying exorbitant interest rates and brutal penalty clauses. Julian turned his monitor toward me. He highlighted a column of dates marked in alarming red text. The balloon payments for 3 separate commercial loans were scheduled to hit in early October. The total sum required to keep his creditors at bay hovered around $5 million. If Marcus missed those deadlines, his creditors possessed the legal authority to seize his remaining minority shares, liquidate his personal assets, and drag him into a highly public bankruptcy court. I stared at the glowing screen synthesizing the data. Marcus was not an affluent developer throwing a lavish party to celebrate his union with my sister. He was a cornered animal. The extravagant wedding booked for September 14th was a calculated, desperate stage production. He needed the event to look as expensive and awe-inspiring as possible to attract new wealthy investors. He planned to use the facade of immense prosperity to solicit fresh capital using the new money to pay off his impending toxic debts. The pieces clicked into a horrifying alignment. Chloe was not just marrying an arrogant man, she was marrying a financial sinkhole. And my parents, blinded by Marcus's tailored suits and smooth-talking charisma, were eager participants in this theatrical display. They had spent decades chasing high society status, and they saw Marcus as their golden ticket into the elite circles they so desperately craved. They were so blinded by the sparkle that they never bothered to inspect the foundation. Julian leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "He is running out of time," Julian observed, his voice calm and methodical. "Men staring down the barrel of public financial ruin do not make rational choices. They look for lifelines, and right now, your parents are standing the closest to him." The air in the kitchen grew heavy with the implication. If Marcus needed immediate liquidity to maintain his wealthy illusion until the wedding, he would inevitably turn his sights toward the most vulnerable targets within his reach. He had already spent whatever remaining cash he possessed to steal my venue and project dominance. Now his coffers were running dangerously low, and the wedding was still months away. My family had ostracized me to protect their glowing reputation, unaware they were actively funding their own demise. They viewed me as a stubborn obstacle standing in the way of their grand societal debut. They failed to realize I was the only person with the analytical skills capable of saving them from a spectacular collapse. I closed my laptop and poured myself a fresh cup of coffee. I had no intention of warning them. When a sinking ship is captained by people who threw you overboard, you do not throw them a life preserver. You simply stand safely on the shore and watch the water rise. The phone vibrating on the counter abruptly broke the silence, signaling the next phase of their desperate extraction plan. The caller identification displayed my father. The timing was too precise. The financial squeeze was already beginning to crush Marcus, and the shockwaves were rippling directly upward toward the people who had blindly signed their names to his illusion. The vibration of the phone against the granite island demanded an answer. I watched the caller identification flash my father's name for a long moment before swiping the screen. Richard bypassed any standard greeting. His voice carried the booming, practiced cadence of a patriarch offering a royal pardon. He proposed a truce. He suggested we meet for dinner at an exclusive downtown steakhouse to smooth over the recent unpleasantness regarding the venue dispute. It was a thinly veiled summons cloaked in forced diplomacy. I knew an ambush awaited me, yet I agreed to the meeting. Avoiding the confrontation would only delay their inevitable panic. I needed to witness the exact magnitude of their financial desperation up close. 3 months prior to the wedding date, I arrived at the restaurant precisely on time. The establishment was a fortress of dark leather booths and aged bourbon catering specifically to power brokers who preferred conducting their negotiations in hushed tones. The maitre d' escorted me to a secluded private dining enclave near the wine cellar. Sitting around the circular mahogany table were my parents, Chloe and Marcus. Marcus wore a bespoke charcoal suit that strained slightly across his broad shoulders. He flashed a heavy luxury watch, but his posture betrayed him. He sat too rigidly, his jaw clenched tight, a stark contrast to his usual arrogant swagger. Chloe sat beside him, dripping in defensive entitlement, clutching a designer handbag like a shield against reality. My parents flanked them, looking tense and overly eager. I took the solitary empty seat opposite my father, maintaining a relaxed, vigilant posture. Richard did not waste time browsing the menu. Before the waiter could even finish pouring the sparkling water, my father leaned forward, resting his elbows on the crisp white tablecloth. He laced his fingers together, projecting the stern authority of an executive preparing to discipline an unruly subordinate. "Harper, we are putting an end to this petty sibling rivalry tonight," Richard dictated, his gaze fixed directly on my face. "Your mother and I have tolerated your defiance long enough. We are a family, and right now your sister requires your unwavering support. Marcus is currently navigating a highly sensitive international corporate merger. It is a monumental deal, and federal regulations have temporarily frozen his liquid capital during the audit phase." Patricia nodded gravely, picking up her cue flawlessly. "The timing is simply unfortunate, Harper. Chloe's event is rapidly approaching, and the premium vendors are demanding their final installments. Because Marcus has his capital tied up in escrow, they are facing a severe cash flow shortage." I kept my expression entirely neutral, studying the beads of condensation forming on my water glass. A temporary cash flow shortage. That was a fascinating euphemism for defaulting on predatory loans and facing imminent bankruptcy. In my line of work, managing crisis communications for top-tier executives, I had unraveled every flavor of financial fiction. This particular lie was exceptionally uninspired. "We know you have been saving diligently." Richard continued, his tone hardening into a direct command. "We also know you no longer have a venue to pay for since you lost your reservation. You are going to wire $100,000 into Marcus's holding account by tomorrow morning. Consider it a short-term family loan. They will repay you with interest the moment the merger clears compliance." The sheer audacity of the demand hung suspended in the dimly lit room. My father was not asking for a favor. He was ordering me to hand over my entire wedding savings to finance my sister's extravagant facade. I shifted my gaze to Marcus. He refused to meet my eyes, opting instead to stare intensely at the polished silverware. Chloe, unable to contain her narcissistic entitlement, scoffed loudly. "It is the least you can do, Harper. You were trying to steal my spotlight anyway. Marcus needs this reception to be flawless. He has invited several international angel investors. This event is a crucial networking opportunity to secure foreign capital for his next high-rise development. If the florist or the caterer walks out now, it reflects poorly on his business acumen. You owe us this." They were literally asking me to bankroll a Ponzi scheme pitch deck. They wanted me to fund the very illusion Marcus was utilizing to lure new victims into his sinking ship. The wedding was merely a stage production, and they expected me to pay the admission fee. I picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, and set it down precisely on the coaster. "I am not a bank, Richard." I stated, my tone devoid of emotion. "I am not financing Chloe's party, and I am certainly not funding an investment scam. My money remains exactly where it is." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face turned a mottled shade of crimson. Patricia gasped, clutching her pearl necklace as if I had uttered a physical threat. Marcus abruptly dropped the suave businessman act. He slammed his palms flat against the heavy wooden table, rattling the crystal wine glasses and drawing sharp glances from the waitstaff stationed near the door. He leaned across the floral centerpiece, his dark eyes blazing with a desperate cornered hostility. "Listen to me very carefully, you smug little clerk." Marcus hissed, his voice dropping to a menacing register. "You think you are untouchable because you spin press releases for a living. I know people in this city. I have media contacts, journalists, and corporate influencers who eat out of my hand. If you do not wire that money, I will launch a smear campaign that will decimate your public relations firm. I will leak fabricated stories about your unethical business practices. I will destroy your client roster before the weekend. You will be toxic." I stared at him, feeling a spark of genuine amusement. He was threatening a veteran crisis manager with a public relations crisis. It was akin to threatening a pyromaniac with a matchbook. He fundamentally misunderstood the arena he was trying to enter. I built my career burying scandals that would make his fragile threats look like amateur hour. "Are you quite finished?" I asked, smoothing the linen napkin on my lap. "If you intend to destroy my firm, you better start drafting those press releases tonight, because you are not getting a single dime from me." Richard stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "You are a disgrace to this family, Harper. If you walk out that door, you are dead to us. We will ensure you are shunned by everyone we know." I remained seated unfazed by the ultimatum. I had already mentally buried them days ago. Just then the waiter appeared carrying a sleek black leather folio containing the bill for our untouched appetizers and the expensive bottle of wine Richard had ordered upon arrival. Seeking to reassert his dominance and project an image of unbothered wealth, Marcus snatched the folio from the waiter's hand. "I will handle this," Marcus announced loudly, throwing a disdainful glare in my direction. "I do not need charity from a glorified secretary." He retrieved a heavy matte black metal credit card from his wallet and tossed it onto the silver tray. It clattered with a distinct weighty sound intended to impress the table. The waiter nodded politely and retreated toward the point-of-sale terminal. The tension at the table simmered. Chloe crossed her arms, glaring at me with venomous resentment. My parents refused to look in my direction, engaging instead in forced, hushed conversation with Marcus about the fictional overseas investors. 3 minutes later, the waiter returned. His professional demeanor was strained, his eyes darting nervously toward Marcus. He leaned down, pitching his voice to a discreet, apologetic whisper. "I am so sorry, sir." The card declined. "Perhaps there is a security hold. Do you have another form of payment?" Marcus stiffened. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen gray. He snatched the black card back, his hands visibly trembling. "Try it again," he snapped, his voice cracking under the pressure. "Run it manually. There is plenty of liquidity on that account. Your machine is malfunctioning." The waiter offered a tight nod and hurried away. The oppressive silence returned, but the power dynamic had shifted drastically. The arrogant posture Marcus had maintained all evening dissolved. He refused to look at Chloe, who was now staring at him with mounting confusion. Richard cleared his throat, suddenly looking very uncomfortable in his tailored suit. The waiter reappeared moments later, looking even more distressed. "Sir, I ran it manually. The issuer has placed a hard restriction on the account." It declined again. Marcus sat frozen, stripped of his armor. The illusion of the affluent developer shattered right there in the dim lighting of the steakhouse. He patted his pockets, pretending to search for another card he knew did not exist. His breathing turned shallow, the reality of his insolvency exposed in front of the very people he was trying to manipulate. I allowed a slow, chilling smile to grace my lips. I opened my designer clutch, retrieved my corporate platinum card, and handed it to the waiter. "I will cover the table," I said smoothly. "And please bring me the merchant receipts for the declined transactions. My accounting department requires a thorough paper trail for expense categorization." The waiter complied swiftly, running my card and returning with the folio. I signed the merchant copy, leaving a generous tip. I then carefully extracted the 2 small slips of thermal paper that documented Marcus's financial humiliation. I stood up, sliding the receipts into my clutch. Chloe looked at me, her eyes wide with a horrific realization she was not quite ready to vocalize. Richard and Patricia remained glued to their seats, paralyzed by the sudden, indisputable evidence of their future son-in-law's lack of funds. "Enjoy the wedding," I told them, my voice echoing lightly in the silent room. "I hear the venue is spectacular." I turned on my heel and walked out of the restaurant, leaving them to drown in the suffocating reality of their choices. As I slid into the back of my waiting town car, the city lights blurred past the tinted windows. I stared at the crumpled thermal paper resting in my palm. Most people look at a declined receipt and see a temporary embarrassment. Crisis managers look at a declined receipt and see a roadmap to a person's deepest vulnerabilities. Marcus had attempted to weaponize his fake wealth against me, demanding my hard-earned savings to prop up his crumbling facade. He had threatened the very public relations firm I built from the ground up, working 80-hour weeks while my parents funded Chloe's endless shopping sprees. His arrogance blinded him to the fact that he was handing a loaded gun to the exact woman who knew how to pull the trigger. I watched the skyline shifting, calculating the timeline we had left. 3 months until September 14th. 3 months for Marcus to grow increasingly desperate as his creditors tightened the noose. My parents had tied their entire social standing to his success, eager to parade their new wealthy son-in-law in front of their country club peers. They had co-signed his loans, gambling their own estate on a man who could not even afford a steak dinner. Julian was waiting for me in the glow of his multi-monitor setup when I entered our apartment. He did not ask how the dinner went. He simply extended his hand, taking the thermal receipt from my fingers. He typed the alphanumeric error code into a specialized decryption terminal. The cursor blinked rapidly, searching through the labyrinth of commercial credit registries. Marcus thought he was a mastermind playing a high-stakes game of real estate monopoly. He failed to realize he had just invited an architect of digital security to audit his entire life. The real game was finally starting. The thermal receipt rested on the sleek glass surface of Julian's desk, a small, crumpled piece of paper that held the key to an entire criminal empire. The string of digits printed beneath the declined transaction amount was not a standard insufficient funds notification. It was a highly specific regulatory freeze code. It indicated that the issuing financial institution had not merely halted the card for suspicious retail activity, but had locked the entire asset portfolio under an active federal review protocol. Julian tapped his mechanical keyboard, the rhythmic clacking filling the quiet space of our home office. He routed his connection through layered offshore proxies in Switzerland and Iceland to mask his digital footprint. As a senior architect specializing in network vulnerabilities, he viewed commercial banking firewalls as mere suggestions rather than actual barriers. He bypassed the superficial consumer data and accessed the commercial credit registries tied to Marcus's primary holding firm. The data populating across Julian's dual-curved monitors painted a gruesome picture. Marcus had spent the last 2 years cultivating a pristine image of a visionary urban developer, breaking ground on luxury condominiums and shaking hands with city council members. He drove the right cars, wore the right suits, and spoke with the booming confidence of a self-made titan. The reality buried in the encrypted ledgers was a financial graveyard. Julian isolated a network of 12 distinct limited liability companies registered in Delaware and Nevada. They possessed no physical offices, no payroll records, and no legitimate revenue streams. They existed solely to shuffle capital back and forth, generating fake invoices to create a dizzying illusion of cash flow. Marcus was executing a textbook Ponzi scheme with chilling precision. He targeted wealthy, unsophisticated individuals looking for exclusive real estate ventures. When new capital flowed into his accounts, he siphoned a fraction of it to pay off the initial investors, branding the transfers as early dividend returns. This manufactured success lured in even more prey, feeding the cycle of deceit. However, the commercial real estate market had tightened over the past fiscal quarter, and the influx of fresh capital had dried up. The fraudulent ledger was collapsing under its own immense weight. Marcus owed millions to predatory private lenders who did not resolve their disputes in civil courtrooms, and the crushing balloon payments were looming on the immediate horizon. This revelation entirely reframed the stolen September 14th wedding date. Chloe genuinely believed she was planning the social event of the decade, a glamorous coronation designed to elevate our family into the upper echelons of high society and prove her superiority over me. But Marcus was orchestrating a desperate high-stakes fundraising gala. Julian pulled up the master guest list Marcus had submitted to the Botanical Conservatory planners. Slipped among the distant relatives and country club friends were 30 high-net-worth angel investors and foreign venture capitalists. The extravagant floral arrangements, the top-tier catering, and the hijacked venue were all elaborate props. Marcus intended to use the luxurious reception to project invincible prosperity, hoping to dazzle these financial titans into injecting a crucial $5 million into his latest fictitious development project. It was the exact amount he needed to satisfy his ruthless creditors and secure a one-way ticket to a jurisdiction lacking an extradition treaty with the United States. He was planning to abandon Chloe the moment the wire transfers cleared. I leaned over Julian's shoulder, tracing the digital breadcrumbs scrolling across the screen. My parents were not merely enabling a toxic narcissistic sister. They were actively underwriting a federal crime. Julian opened a scanned portable document format file extracted from a secondary lending institution. It was a commercial loan guarantee agreement. At the bottom of the final page, beneath blocks of dense legal jargon detailing exorbitant default penalties, were the verified digital signatures of Richard and Patricia. To secure the bridge loans keeping his Ponzi scheme afloat for the final crucial months, Marcus required substantial collateral. My parents, blinded by their desperate hunger for elite status and their unwavering worship of Chloe, had leveraged the family estate. They had signed away the sprawling mansion I grew up in, staking their entire financial foundation and their retirement on Marcus's hollow promises. I stared at their signatures, feeling a profound, chilling detachment. If the September 14th wedding failed to produce the $5 million investment, the house of cards would implode with devastating velocity. Marcus would face a lengthy federal prison sentence for wire fraud and securities violations. My parents would lose their home facing sudden humiliating destitution in their twilight years, while the country club peers they desperately tried to impress watched their downfall. The temptation to pick up my phone and dial my contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation was immense. One anonymous tip, detailing the shell companies and the offshore routing numbers, would trigger an immediate, overwhelming raid. Marcus would be arrested in his tailored suit before the weekend, and my parents would face the crushing reality of their foolishness. But a quiet arrest in a sterile office building felt entirely insufficient. My family had spent my entire life minimizing my achievements, treating my corporate career as a tedious hobby, while celebrating Chloe's superficial milestones. They had maliciously orchestrated the theft of my wedding date and attempted to extort my hard-earned savings over a steak dinner. Handing the evidence to the authorities now would spare them the public humiliation they so richly deserved. It would give them the opportunity to play the victims, claiming they were tragically deceived by a smooth-talking con artist who manipulated their trusting nature. They would spin the narrative to garner sympathy from their social circle. I refused to grant them that luxury. I looked at Julian. He read the calculated predatory intent in my eyes and mirrored my stillness. We were not going to halt the wedding. We were going to let them build the stage, hire the orchestra, and invite every powerful investor they could find. We would allow Marcus to reach the exact precipice of his salvation, standing under the bright lights in his custom tuxedo, believing he had successfully pulled off the ultimate heist. I wanted him to taste the victory, to feel the relief washing over him right before the floor gave out beneath his feet. I wanted my parents to witness the destruction of their golden idol in a room full of the very people they sought to impress. I instructed Julian to compile the evidence into a secure encrypted dossier and bury it deep within our offline servers. We would hold the lethal strike in reserve until the perfect moment presented itself. We needed the trap to snap shut when the audience was largest and the stakes were at their absolute peak. However, denying Marcus the $100,000 at the restaurant had introduced a volatile new variable into our timeline. The initial panic of the declined credit card would rapidly metastasize into frantic, unpredictable aggression. A cornered fraudster lacking the necessary funds to maintain his illusion is a highly dangerous adversary. Since they could no longer extract my money quietly through intimidation, they would need to manufacture a distraction to keep the skeptical vendors at bay, while simultaneously tearing me down to elevate their own precarious standing. The quiet, passive-aggressive hostility was officially over. As I watched Julian lock down our network security, I knew the public character assassination was about to begin, and Chloe was preparing to fire the first shot. The illusion of control Marcus and Chloe desperately clung to began to fracture just 2 weeks after the disastrous steakhouse dinner. The catalyst was a seemingly minor administrative detail that carried massive financial implications for their fraudulent operation. Julian and I had maintained strict operational security regarding our new venue, the private estate secured through my billionaire client Elias. We quietly dispatched our revised, highly encrypted digital invitations to our curated guest list. The list naturally contained a significant overlap with Chloe's, particularly among the elite corporate tier. Several prominent venture capitalists and high-net-worth executives individuals. Marcus, critically required to attend his grand illusion to secure his bailout funding, received both invitations for September 14th. Faced with a choice between an ostentatious public spectacle hosted by a relatively unknown developer and a highly exclusive invite-only gathering hosted by a renowned crisis management director and a top-tier cybersecurity architect, the corporate elite made the pragmatic business decision. They chose the latter. The RSVPs began rolling in, and a significant portion of Marcus's targeted angel investors quietly declined Chloe's invitation, citing scheduling conflicts while simultaneously confirming their attendance at our classified event. When Chloe realized that her designated VIP section was rapidly emptying, the resulting meltdown was spectacular. She did not perceive it as a simple scheduling overlap. In her deeply narcissistic reality, it was a deliberate, malicious attack on her superiority. She believed I was actively stealing her audience. Deprived of the wealthy targets he needed to pitch his Ponzi scheme, Marcus's financial panic intensified, feeding Chloe's rage until it boiled over into a vicious offensive. If they could not force me to surrender my savings or cancel my date through intimidation, they would destroy my reputation so thoroughly that my guests would be too disgusted to attend. On a Tuesday morning, I sat in my corner office reviewing a mitigation strategy for a corporate client facing a severe data breach. My desk phone, private mobile device, and email inbox all erupted simultaneously. It was a synchronized digital assault. My assistant, a sharp young professional named Maya, stepped into my office, her face pale. She handed me a tablet displaying a rapidly trending thread on a prominent local business forum. The posts were entirely anonymous, but crafted with a toxic familiarity that unmistakably identified the author. Chloe had hired a shadow marketing firm, a digital seeding agency specializing in astroturfing and reputation destruction. They deployed a coordinated swarm of bot accounts to amplify a fabricated narrative across multiple platforms. The posts accused a certain high-profile crisis manager of systemic corporate embezzlement, alleging I siphoned funds from vulnerable clients to finance a secret lavish lifestyle. The smear campaign escalated, weaving in grotesque personal attacks, claiming I maliciously sabotaged my own family, attempting to ruin my sister's wedding out of bitter, unhinged jealousy. Within an hour, the manufactured scandal had leaped from obscure forums to local gossip blogs. Reporters from 2 mid-level financial publications called my firm seeking comment on the embezzlement allegations. Marcus and Chloe were attempting to leverage public humiliation to force my hand, hoping the threat of professional ruin would compel me to cancel my event and fade into the background. They assumed a public relations professional would panic at the prospect of becoming the center of a scandal, expecting me to issue frantic denials and desperate apologies. They failed to comprehend the fundamental nature of my expertise. A crisis manager does not engage with anonymous mudslinging. Engaging validates the attack and provides the adversary with the oxygen of attention. You do not negotiate with digital terrorists. You cut off their supply lines. I did not draft a single press release or post a defensive statement. Instead, I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and initiated a severe corporate lockdown. I instructed Maya to route all external press inquiries to a sterile automated legal voicemail. Julian, operating from his own secure terminal, deployed an aggressive firewall protocol across my firm's entire network infrastructure, instantly identifying and blocking the IP addresses associated with Chloe's hired bot farm. He isolated the source servers and flooded them with a barrage of automated cease and desist notices carrying the full weight of federal cyber harassment statutes. The digital noise was effectively neutralized within 45 minutes, sealing my professional fortress. However, playing defense was merely the first phase of the engagement. Chloe and Marcus had thrown a stone at my glass house. It was time to drop a boulder on theirs. They believed they could operate in the shadows using anonymous accounts to inflict damage while maintaining their polished public facade. I possessed the very real, highly classified data Julian had extracted from Marcus's rotting financial network, and I knew exactly who would be most interested in that information. I opened a heavily encrypted, untraceable email client. I did not target the media or social networks. I targeted the apex predators lurking in Marcus's financial ecosystem. Julian's previous reconnaissance had identified the specific predatory private lenders holding the massive impending balloon payments that Marcus was desperately trying to evade. These were not regulated banking institutions that operated with polite corporate patience. These were ruthless entities that utilized aggressive, often legally borderline tactics to recover their capital. I drafted a series of brief, highly specific anonymous messages. I did not include accusations or emotional narratives. I provided raw, indisputable data. I informed the lenders that their primary debtor, Marcus, was currently prioritizing the expenditure of hundreds of thousands of dollars on a luxury wedding event scheduled for September 14th, rather than securing the necessary capital to satisfy his maturing debt obligations. To verify the claim, I attached copies of the exorbitant vendor contracts and non-refundable deposit receipts Marcus had recently signed to hijack the Botanical Conservatory. I routed the messages through an offshore server in Singapore, ensuring the transmission origin was impossible to trace, and hit send. The retaliation was swift, brutal, and entirely invisible to the public eye. Within 24 hours, the pressure on Marcus escalated from a slow suffocation to a violent strangulation. The private lenders, furious at the revelation that their capital was being squandered on floral arrangements and champagne towers, while their loans edged closer to default, tightened their grip. They did not send polite reminder emails. They initiated aggressive collection protocols. Julian, monitoring Marcus's network traffic through the back doors he had established, observed a frantic spike in communication. Marcus's phone lines were jammed with incoming calls from collection agencies and hostile creditors demanding immediate liquidation of assets. Legal notices of intent to seize his minority shares in the various shell companies began flooding his inbox. The illusion of the wealthy developer was crumbling under the immense, crushing weight of his actual liabilities. The stress fractured Marcus's carefully maintained composure. He could no longer focus on the elaborate wedding preparations or the petty social media war Chloe was waging. He was fighting for his actual survival, trapped in a rapidly shrinking corner. The angel investors he desperately needed to pitch at the wedding had declined the invitation. His creditors were actively hunting him, and his access to fresh capital was entirely blocked. The crushing financial pressure forced a radical shift in his strategy. The initial plan to simply host a flashy party and charm investors into handing over $5 million was no longer viable. He needed a massive, immediate influx of untraceable cash just to prevent the lenders from freezing his remaining operating accounts before the wedding even took place. The conventional avenues of fraud had been exhausted. Driven by pure, unadulterated panic, Marcus was compelled to seek out a far more dangerous, infinitely more destructive escape route, setting the stage for a catastrophic escalation that would test the very limits of their depravity. The heavy, suffocating pressure surrounding Marcus finally reached a critical breaking point, exactly 48 hours before our competing weddings were scheduled to commence. The digital dragnet Julian had cast over Marcus's financial ecosystem remained silent for days, a deceptive calm that suggested the fraudulent developer had either surrendered to his impending bankruptcy or was gathering his remaining resources for a final desperate gambit. As a crisis manager, I know that desperate people rarely choose surrender. They opt for escalation. I was sitting in our downtown condo reviewing the final security protocols for Elias's private estate when Julian's primary monitor flashed a sharp amber warning light. A specialized algorithm he designed to track obfuscated financial movements had snagged a highly irregular transaction. Marcus had bypassed the traditional banking infrastructure entirely. He executed a sudden transfer utilizing a decentralized cryptocurrency exchange, moving a substantial sum of digital assets out of a hidden secondary wallet. Julian traced the blockchain trajectory with methodical precision. The destination address did not belong to a vendor, a caterer, or a high-end tailor. It resolved to a digital wallet frequently flagged in cybersecurity circles for its association with illicit logistical services. Marcus had just wired the equivalent of $15,000 to a black market contractor known for executing specialized off-the-books physical operations. You do not hire an underground contractor 2 days before your luxury wedding to fix a floral arrangement. You hire them to break something. The financial data provided the motive and the transaction, but we needed the specific operational blueprint. To acquire that, Julian relied on a piece of physical reconnaissance he had executed weeks prior during the tense extortion dinner at the steakhouse. While Marcus was throwing his tantrum and Chloe was clutching her designer handbag in defensive arrogance, Julian had smoothly dropped his napkin. Bending down to retrieve it, he covertly attached a microscopic military-grade acoustic transmitter to the underside of Chloe's purse strap. It was a device smaller than a shirt button, entirely undetectable, without professional counter-surveillance equipment, capable of transmitting crystal-clear audio via cellular networks. We had monitored their banal conversations for weeks, enduring hours of Chloe's narcissistic complaints and Marcus's increasingly frantic phone calls with his lawyers. However, the audio file that uploaded to our secure server late that Thursday evening was not a standard complaint. It was a chilling, meticulously detailed conspiracy to commit federal insurance fraud. Julian isolated the audio track and ran it through a noise reduction filter, broadcasting the conversation into our quiet living room. The recording captured the ambient acoustics of what sounded like an echoing, empty commercial space, likely the botanical conservatory they had hijacked from me. Marcus's voice cut through the recording, stripped of its usual booming bravado, replaced by a cold, calculating desperation. The investors backed out. Chloe Marcus stated, his tone flat and unyielding. The seed capital we needed to bridge the gap is gone. The private lenders are preparing to file the seizure motions on Monday morning. If we host this reception and walk away with nothing but envelopes full of gift cards, I am bankrupt, and your parents lose the house. The wedding is a dead end. We need liquid cash immediately, and we need a lot of it. Chloe's voice trembled, a rare manifestation of genuine fear piercing her superficial armor. What are you saying, Marcus? We cannot just cancel. My friends are flying in. The press is expecting a spectacle. We will be ruined socially. We are not canceling it, Marcus replied smoothly. We are going to let a catastrophic act of God cancel it for us. He proceeded to outline a plan so breathtakingly malicious, it bordered on sociopathic. Marcus had secured a massive comprehensive event cancellation insurance policy when he bought out the venue contract, a standard requirement for high-liability luxury events. The policy included a specific clause guaranteeing a $2 million expedited payout in the event of severe unforeseen structural damage that rendered the venue entirely uninhabitable within 24 hours of the event. Marcus explained he had hired a specialized contractor to infiltrate the conservatory late Friday night. The operative would bypass the venue security and deliberately rupture the primary high-pressure water main connected to the indoor commercial fire suppression system. The ensuing deluge would release thousands of gallons of water per minute, instantly flooding the grand ballroom, destroying the hardwood floors, ruining the electrical grid, and guaranteeing the complete cancellation of the event under the guise of a tragic, unavoidable plumbing failure. They would file the emergency insurance claim Saturday morning, playing the roles of the devastated, heartbroken couple. The $2 million payout would provide Marcus with the exact, untraceable liquidity he needed to satisfy his most aggressive creditors and escape the immediate threat of federal indictment. But the sheer arrogance of their conspiracy did not end with the arson. Chloe, ever obsessed with her social standing and desperate to maintain the illusion of her superiority, raised a critical logistical flaw. If the venue is destroyed, where do we host the reception? Chloe asked, her voice whining with petulant frustration. We still need the photographs. We still need the audience. Marcus let out a low, humorless chuckle. That is the beauty of the strategy, Chloe. We already have a backup venue fully prepared and paid for. We use your sister. He laid out the final twisting phase of their plot. After the engineered flood destroyed their location, they intended to weaponize the concept of familial duty. They planned to invoke an emergency, leveraging the chaotic situation, to guilt-trip my parents into demanding that I surrender my highly secured secret location to them. Marcus confidently predicted that I, the supposedly compliant and emotionally desperate older sister, would fold under the immense familial pressure. They would swoop in, hijack the private estate Elias had provided, host their lavish party on my dime, and walk away with $2 million in stolen insurance money. They viewed me as nothing more than a convenient default contingency plan, an object to be utilized and discarded to facilitate their criminal enterprise. I sat perfectly still, listening to the recording play out. They had crossed the threshold from petty narcissistic bullies into organized criminals plotting massive property destruction and insurance extortion. They believed their plan was an airtight masterpiece of manipulation. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that they had just handed a veteran crisis manager a fully recorded, highly detailed confession. Julian paused the audio playback, turning his gaze toward me. The blue light from the monitors cast sharp shadows across his face. He did not ask if I wanted to alert the authorities or contact the venue management to prevent the sabotage. He already knew the protocol. Preventing the crime now would only allow Marcus to deny his involvement, claim the audio was fabricated, and find another, perhaps more violent method to secure his funds. To achieve absolute destruction, you must allow the adversary to commit fully to their catastrophic mistake. I nodded silently. Julian immediately ran the audio file through an encryption protocol, sealing the recording into a tamper-proof digital container. He attached a verified chain of custody log, proving the exact origin and timestamp of the data. We locked the lethal evidence into a staging folder on our secure server, waiting for the precise moment to deploy it. The battlefield was set, and the rules of engagement had fundamentally shifted. My family believed they were orchestrating a brilliant, chaotic emergency that would force me to bend the knee and surrender my joy to save their reputation. They thought they were the masterminds directing a grand tragedy. They had no idea I was quietly holding the match, entirely prepared to let them burn their own empire to the ground, setting the stage for a spectacular collision that would leave them with absolutely nowhere to run. The atmosphere inside Elias's private estate was thick with focused, quiet energy as the clock edged past 10 on Friday night. My production team moved swiftly through the grand halls, finalizing the intricate lighting arrangements and confirming the catering schedules for the following morning. There was no chaotic rushing, no frantic bridal panic. We operated with the smooth, synchronized precision of a military unit preparing for deployment. Julian sat in a secluded corner of the library, his laptop screen casting a faint glow as he monitored the external security feeds and maintained his digital watch over Marcus's network. We were waiting for the disaster to unfold exactly as choreographed. At precisely 11:14, the silence was shattered by a cascade of digital alerts. Julian's specialized tracking software, hooked into the local emergency dispatch frequencies, lit up like a switchboard. A massive Tier 3 water rescue and structural compromise alarm was triggered at the Botanical Conservatory downtown. The hired operative had executed the sabotage flawlessly. According to the intercepted dispatch chatter, the primary high-pressure suppression, main located in the ceiling above the grand ballroom, had suffered a catastrophic failure. Thousands of gallons of highly pressurized rust-colored water were currently violently blasting through the structural drywall, flooding the elegant space in a matter of minutes. The imported floral arrangements, the custom staging, and the expensive electrical equipment were instantly submerged under 2 feet of muddy ruin. The venue was completely and officially decimated. I stepped away from the logistical blueprints and walked over to Julian, watching the incoming data stream. Local news outlets constantly monitoring emergency frequencies for breaking stories had already dispatched helicopters to capture the scene. Live aerial footage displayed emergency vehicles surrounding the historic conservatory, their flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the pooling water seeping out from the shattered glass doors. Within minutes, the secondary phase of their fraudulent operation commenced. Julian intercepted a flurry of frantic text messages sent from Marcus's device directly to an elite emergency claims adjuster. Marcus was demanding an immediate, on-site assessment to initiate the $2 million cancellation payout. He was actively playing the role of the devastated, heartbroken groom, standing ankle-deep in water, yelling at the bewildered venue staff while secretly securing his illicit payday. The sheer breathtaking audacity of initiating an insurance extortion scheme, while fire crews were still securing the perimeter, was staggering. We did not have to wait long for the inevitable pivot. Exactly 50 minutes after the initial flood alert, my personal cell phone began to vibrate steadily against the polished mahogany desk. The caller identification displayed my father's name. The timing was entirely predictable. The engineered crisis had concluded, and the extortion phase was officially launching. I let the phone ring 3 times, controlling my breathing, to ensure my voice carried the appropriate tone of weary exhaustion. I swiped the screen and answered. "Harper, we have a catastrophic emergency," Richard declared, his voice booming through the receiver. He bypassed any greeting or inquiry into my well-being, launching straight into a heavily manufactured, frantic narrative. The conservatory suffered a massive pipe burst. The entire venue is a total loss. Chloe is hysterical. She is sitting in the hotel lobby in tears, completely inconsolable. The wedding is ruined. I paused, injecting a note of mild, rehearsed surprise into my response. "That is terrible, Dad. Is everyone safe?" "Everyone is physically unharmed, but the financial and social implications are a disaster." Richard snapped, his patience evaporating rapidly. "The international investors Marcus flew in are expecting a premier event tomorrow morning. We cannot simply cancel and send them back to their hotels. It would completely destroy his professional credibility and humiliate this family on a global scale. We require an immediate solution." He did not ask if I had ideas. He did not plead for assistance. He maneuvered directly to the demand they had rehearsed in their recorded conspiracy. "You kept your backup venue classified." Richard continued, his tone shifting from frantic to a cold, authoritative command. "You are going to provide us with the address and the security clearances right now. We are merging the events. You will hand over the primary access to Chloe and Marcus." I remained perfectly still, looking at Julian across the room. "Merging the events," I echoed, playing the role of the confused, hesitant daughter. "What exactly does that entail?" "Dad, it means Chloe has lost her haul, and you cannot be selfish enough to hoard a secured location while your family faces public humiliation." Richard dictated, his voice hardening into steel. "We will utilize your venue. You will instruct your coordinators to accommodate our 300 guests. Because Chloe has suffered this traumatic disruption, Marcus and Chloe will conduct their ceremony first. You and Julian can hold a smaller, quiet service afterward. You must step back and allow your sister to salvage her day. It is your duty to this family." The sheer, unfathomable entitlement hung in the silent library. He was demanding that I surrender my entire wedding, absorb their massive guest list, and willingly downgrade myself to a secondary background participant at my own event, all to preserve the fragile ego and fraudulent business facade of a criminal. He genuinely believed that a lifetime of emotional conditioning would compel me to fold under the weight of his authoritative decree. I let a heavy, dramatic silence stretch over the connection, allowing my father to believe I was wrestling with profound emotional conflict. I looked at the encrypted dossier Julian had compiled on his screen, containing the audio confession of their arson plot and the glaring proof of their Ponzi scheme. "Okay, Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a soft, compliant whisper. "If it will save the family from embarrassment, you can use the venue." I heard a sharp, collective exhale on the other end of the line. Patricia was clearly hovering nearby, listening on speakerphone. The relief in my father's response was palpable, dripping with arrogant satisfaction. "That is the right decision," Harper, Richard said, his tone softening into a patronizing hum. "You are finally showing some maturity. Send the location details immediately. We have to notify the guests." "I cannot just text the address," I replied, smoothly injecting a layer of logistical necessity into my compliance. "The estate is secured by a private military contractor. They require physical encrypted entry passes to clear vehicles through the outer perimeter. I will send a courier to your hotel with a sealed envelope. It contains the exact coordinates, the security manifests, and the routing instructions for your guests. Tell Marcus to direct his entire party to arrive at 10 o'clock sharp tomorrow morning." "Excellent," Richard agreed, eager to conclude the conversation, now that he had extracted his prize. "Have the courier there in 20 minutes. We will handle the rest." The line went dead. I lowered the phone, a cold, predatory smile spreading across my face. They thought they had broken my resolve. They believed their manufactured tragedy had successfully manipulated me into surrendering my sanctuary, transforming my wedding into their ultimate safety net. They were entirely convinced that they had outmaneuvered me, securing a free luxury venue while pocketing $2 million in stolen insurance cash. I turned to Julian. "Print the routing instructions and seal the envelope," I instructed, my voice sharp and decisive. Julian pulled a thick black cardstock envelope from his briefcase, sliding the encrypted access codes inside. He sealed it with a stark crimson wax stamp. We were not merely providing them with a location. We were providing them with highly specific, engineered coordinates designed to funnel their entire fraudulent operation directly into an inescapable choke point. They thought they had bullied me into submission. They did not realize they had just demanded the keys to their own slaughterhouse, and I was more than happy to hold the door wide open for them. The grand trap was fully armed, and tomorrow morning the predators would confidently march their entire audience right into the center of the kill zone. The morning of September 14th broke crisp and clear the autumn sun, casting sharp, elongated shadows across the manicured grounds of Elias's private estate. Inside the master suite, converted into a high-security staging area, the atmosphere was entirely devoid of the typical bridal anxiety. I sat before a towering gilded mirror, enveloped in a custom-tailored ivory silk gown. The fabric draped with severe architectural precision, devoid of frivolous lace or excessive embellishments. It was a garment designed not for a fairy tale princess, but for a corporate executioner preparing to deliver a fatal blow. My reflection stared back at me, displaying a face stripped of any lingering familial guilt. The makeup artist worked in silence, applying a stark minimalist palette that highlighted the cold, unyielding resolve in my eyes. There were no tears to smudge the mascara, no frantic pacing, no last-minute doubts. The chaotic, desperate girl my family had bullied and marginalized for 3 decades was permanently erased. The woman sitting in that chair was a predator patiently waiting for her prey to stumble blindly into the crosshairs. The heavy oak door of the suite clicked open, and Julian stepped inside. He wore a sharp midnight blue tuxedo, his demeanor exuding the calm, lethal focus of a cybersecurity architect who had successfully locked down an entire grid. He did not ask how I was feeling. He knew the emotional processing had concluded weeks ago. He walked up behind my chair, his dark eyes meeting mine in the mirror's reflection. "The perimeter is secure," Julian reported his steady. "The private security detail has established a 3-tier defensive ring around the entire property. We have 40 personnel on site entirely composed of former federal agents and elite military contractors. They control the main gates, the secondary access roads, and the internal choke points. The communication jammers are primed, and the digital surveillance net is actively scanning incoming license plates against the manifest. No one enters or leaves without our explicit authorization." I nodded slowly, adjusting a simple diamond stud earring. "It is time to let them in," I murmured. Miles away in the chaotic lobby of a luxury downtown hotel, a vastly different scene was unfolding. Through the specialized tracking software Julian had covertly embedded in Marcus's digital communications, we monitored the frantic, arrogant scramble of my family's operation. Chloe, vibrating with a toxic mixture of adrenaline and narcissistic triumph, was aggressively barking orders at her beleaguered bridal party. She clutched the black cardstock envelope I had sent the night before as if it were a royal decree validating her ultimate superiority. We intercepted the mass text message broadcast she initiated to her 300 guests. The message was a masterpiece of manufactured grace under pressure. It cited a tragic, unforeseen venue emergency, but triumphantly announced a seamless relocation to an exclusive, highly secured private estate. Chloe spun the narrative perfectly, portraying herself and Marcus as resilient, powerful figures capable of executing a miraculous logistical pivot overnight. She genuinely believed she had orchestrated the ultimate heist. In her deeply flawed reality, she had successfully weaponized a crisis to conquer my secret venue, forcing me to surrender my resources to elevate her grand spectacle. She envisioned walking down a pre-assembled, luxurious aisle, entirely funded by my efforts, while pocketing a $2 million fraudulent insurance claim. She thought she was the mastermind directing a brilliant corporate acquisition. Simultaneously, Marcus was working his network with reckless desperation. Audio intercepts captured him making frantic calls to the elite angel investors and foreign venture capitalists who had originally RSVP'd. He leveraged the exclusive nature of the new location, bragging about the intense security clearance required to enter the estate. He promised them a display of unparalleled prosperity, a gathering of the most influential political and financial minds in the state. He was actively utilizing my impenetrable fortress as the ultimate prop to validate his crumbling Ponzi scheme, desperately trying to lure those investors into handing over the $5 million he required to evade federal prison. They were blind drunk on their perceived invincibility. They failed to realize that every step they took toward the estate was a step deeper into a meticulously engineered snare. The digital tracking map on Julian's tablet began to light up with a steady stream of incoming signals. The migration had commenced. A sprawling convoy of sleek black town cars, luxury sports utility vehicles, and stretch limousines departed from the downtown hotel, carrying the heavily scrutinized guests of Marcus's fraudulent empire. These were not ordinary wedding attendees. They were powerful, calculating individuals, prominent politicians, ruthless corporate executives, and wealthy international investors. They rode in comfortable silence, holding thick envelopes containing substantial financial contributions, completely unaware that they were being herded toward an impending legal and public relations catastrophe. They believed they were arriving to celebrate a lucrative business alliance. They had no idea they were about to witness a highly coordinated federal takedown. I stood up, smoothing the pristine silk of my gown. The physical weight of the fabric felt grounding. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, pulling back the heavy velvet curtain, just enough to observe the winding tree-lined driveway approaching the estate's formidable wrought iron gates. The first black vehicles appeared on the horizon, moving like a slow, dark serpent through the autumn foliage. The trap, built on months of agonizing surveillance, financial auditing, and psychological endurance, was finally snapping shut. The arrogant perpetrators and their wealthy, unsuspecting audience were delivering themselves directly into my hands. "Let the processing begin," I instructed Julian, turning away from the window. "We have a very specific protocol for our distinguished guests." Julian tapped a command into his tablet, authorizing the security teams at the outer perimeter to initiate the specialized intake procedure. The final collection phase of my operation was officially active. The guests arriving at the gates were about to experience a level of security clearance that would permanently sever their connection to the outside world, setting the stage for a revelation they could never escape, unsee, or deny. The lead vehicle of the sprawling convoy, a pristine white Rolls-Royce transporting Marcus and Chloe, rolled to a smooth halt before the towering wrought iron gates of the estate. The heavy metal barrier remained firmly shut, offering no immediate access, despite the extravagant display of wealth idling on the driveway. Flanking the entrance stood 4 security contractors, clad in sharp, unmarked black tactical gear. Their posture was rigid, their expressions concealed behind dark aviator sunglasses. They projected an aura of severe, uncompromising authority that sharply contrasted with the celebratory mood of the arriving passengers. Inside the luxury vehicle, the initial annoyance at the delay quickly morphed into a misguided sense of profound self-importance. Marcus, desperate to validate his fabricated billionaire status in front of the trailing investors, viewed the intense security not as an obstacle, but as a crucial prop. He rolled down the tinted window, flashing a broad, arrogant smile at the lead security officer, fully expecting a deferential greeting. "We are the bridal party," Marcus announced, his voice booming with forced joviality. "You can go ahead and open the gates. The rest of the VIP convoy is right behind us." The security officer did not smile. He did not move to trigger the gate mechanism. Instead, he stepped closer to the vehicle, holding a biometric scanning tablet. He operated under strict, pre-approved directives formulated to neutralize any potential interference during the final phase of the operation. "Sir," the officer stated, his voice a flat, mechanical drone. "Due to the highly sensitive nature of today's gathering and the presence of several prominent international investors, the estate owners have mandated a strict zero-tolerance confidentiality protocol. We require all guests, including the primary bridal party, to surrender all mobile devices, recording equipment, and smartwatches before breaching the inner perimeter. These items will be secured in individual locked Faraday bags and returned upon departure." Chloe leaned across Marcus, her perfectly contoured face twisting into a mask of indignant outrage. "Surrender our phones!" Chloe shrieked, her voice pitching upward in disbelief. "Are you insane? I am the bride. I have social media teams waiting for updates. I have vendors to coordinate. You cannot possibly expect me to hand over my phone." The officer remained entirely impassive, his stance unwavering. "My apologies, ma'am," he replied, betraying no emotion. "Those are the absolute security requirements for entry. We must ensure complete privacy for the high-net-worth individuals in attendance. If you refuse to comply, I am authorized to instruct your driver to turn the vehicle around immediately." The threat of being denied entry, of losing the luxurious stage she had so desperately fought to steal, silenced Chloe instantly. She looked at Marcus, panic flickering in her eyes. The entire facade depended on gaining access to this specific venue. Marcus, however, interpreted the strict protocol entirely differently. In his deeply flawed, narcissistic reality, he saw an opportunity to project ultimate dominance. He turned to Chloe, offering a patronizing, reassuring pat on her knee. "Relax, Chloe." Marcus murmured, his tone dripping with arrogant condescension. "This is exactly how top-tier corporate summits operate. Elite investors demand absolute discretion to prevent insider trading leaks and corporate espionage. This level of security actually makes us look incredibly powerful. It proves we run in circles that require total confidentiality." Eager to impress the billionaires waiting in the cars behind him, Marcus confidently retrieved his expensive smartphone from his jacket pocket and handed it to the officer. He unbuckled his smartwatch, tossing it into the provided sterile plastic bag with a dramatic flourish. He then turned a stern, commanding gaze toward Chloe, silently demanding her compliance. Faced with the terrifying prospect of losing her audience and her grand entrance, Chloe reluctantly dug into her designer clutch. She surrendered her phone, her manicured fingers trembling slightly as the officer sealed the device inside the specialized locking pouch. The security protocol systematically repeated itself down the entire line of waiting vehicles. My parents, arriving in the second car, eagerly handed over their devices, thrilling at the prospect of attending an event so exclusive it required federal-level security measures. The wealthy investors, accustomed to strict non-disclosure environments, complied without protest, further validating Marcus's delusional narrative. They willingly, eagerly surrendered their only means of external communication. They isolated themselves from the outside world, completely unaware that they were stepping into an impenetrable digital and physical blackout zone. Once the devices were secured, the heavy iron gates slowly swung open, permitting the convoy to enter the sprawling grounds. The vehicles were directed away from the main grand ballroom entrance and instead routed toward a secluded, highly secure annex building located on the far edge of the property. The security team briskly escorted Marcus, Chloe, and my parents out of their vehicles and ushered them into a lavishly appointed holding suite within the annex. The room featured plush leather seating, a fully stocked premium bar, and soundproof walls. It was undeniably opulent, designed to pacify the occupants, but it was fundamentally a gilded cage. The moment the heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind them, the electronic deadbolt engaged with a sharp, definitive snap. The magnetic locks sealed the perimeter. They were entirely isolated, cut off from their guests, their vendors, and their escape routes. They settled into the leather sofas, pouring expensive champagne, convinced they were relaxing in an exclusive VIP lounge, while the event staff finalized the preparations for their grand debut. They had no idea they had just been successfully quarantined. Back in the command center of the master suite, Julian watched the security feeds confirm the lockdown of the annex. He turned toward his primary terminal, his hands hovering over the illuminated keyboard. The physical containment was complete. It was time to execute the digital strike. Julian opened the heavily encrypted staging folder we had painstakingly compiled over the past several weeks. It contained the complete, unredacted forensic breakdown of Marcus's sprawling financial crimes. The files detailed the offshore routing numbers, the fabricated vendor invoices, the rapid depletion of investor capital, and the undeniable mathematical proof of the Ponzi structure. Appended to the financial data was the pristine audio recording capturing Marcus and Chloe actively conspiring to commit arson and insurance extortion at the Botanical Conservatory. This was not a mere complaint or a vague accusation. It was a fully realized trial-ready federal indictment wrapped in a digital package. I stood beside Julian watching the progress bars hovering on the screen. The targets were isolated. The evidence was irrefutable. "Send it!" I commanded, my voice cold and unwavering. Julian struck the enter key with a sharp, decisive movement. The encrypted data packets bypassed standard communication channels, utilizing specialized routing protocols to ensure immediate priority delivery. The first transmission hit the secure whistleblower hotline of the Securities and Exchange Commission, instantly flagging Marcus's primary holding companies for catastrophic securities fraud. Simultaneously, the second transmission bypassed regional offices and landed directly on the active monitoring servers of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division, specifically targeting the task force responsible for major insurance fraud and interstate financial crimes. The digital payload breached their systems, triggering automated high-priority alerts across multiple federal agencies. We provided the authorities with the exact GPS coordinates of the private estate, confirming that the primary suspect, along with several key witnesses and potential co-conspirators, were currently contained in a single highly secure location. The invisible fuse was lit. The devastating federal machinery we had actively courted was now rushing toward our coordinates, bringing with it the crushing, inescapable reality that Marcus and Chloe desperately believed they could outrun. While they sat in their soundproof cage toasting to their fabricated success, the architects of their ruin were already speeding down the highway, armed with tactical gear and federal arrest warrants, preparing to violently dismantle their illusion. The digital payload was speeding through secure federal channels, triggering alarm bells in government offices miles away. Inside the estate, however, the atmosphere remained a portrait of serene, orchestrated luxury. While Marcus and Chloe languished in their soundproof holding suite, convinced they were simply awaiting their grand entrance, the true mechanics of the operation were shifting into the final phase. The stage was set, and the audience needed to be seated before the curtain could rise on the execution. My meticulously assembled team of event coordinators operating under Julian's strict logistical parameters intercepted the remaining vehicles from the convoy. 300 guests, a volatile mixture of Chloe's superficial social circle and Marcus's targeted high-net-worth angel investors, were guided seamlessly from the driveway toward the soaring entrance of the Grand Conservatory. They moved through the heavy glass doors, instantly enveloped by the breathtaking opulence of Elias's private estate. The vaulted ceilings featured intricate glasswork that filtered the mid-morning sunlight, casting a warm, ethereal glow over the immaculate interior. Towering arrangements of white orchids and rare hydrangeas lined the pristine marble aisle. A string quartet positioned discreetly in a recessed alcove played a gentle classical melody that masked the underlying tension radiating from the security personnel standing watch at the perimeter. The guests, stripped of their mobile devices and isolated from the outside world, surrendered entirely to the manufactured ambiance. They murmured in hushed, awestruck tones, admiring the sheer scale of the wealth surrounding them. The investors, men and women accustomed to evaluating corporate assets and scrutinizing profit margins, analyzed the lavish setting and mistakenly perceived it as undeniable proof of Marcus's financial solvency. The opulent venue effectively sedated their critical instincts, validating the very illusion Marcus had desperately constructed. They took their seats along the velvet-lined pews, completely oblivious to the fact that they had been expertly corralled into a highly secured environment, preparing to witness a spectacle far more devastating than a simple wedding ceremony. From my vantage point in the concealed bridal staging area, positioned just behind the massive towering oak doors at the head of the aisle, I monitored the final seating arrangements through a specialized closed-circuit feed on Julian's tablet. The audience was captive. The investors were positioned strategically near the front, perfectly aligned to absorb the incoming shockwave. I smoothed the architectural lines of my ivory silk gown. There were no nervous tremors, no frantic adjustments. I felt a cold, crystalline calm settle deep within my chest. I turned to Julian. He stood beside me, his dark tuxedo immaculate, his expression a mask of lethal, unyielding resolve. We did not need to exchange words of encouragement. The silent communication between a crisis manager and a cybersecurity architect about to detonate a social bomb required no translation. I gave a short, definitive nod to the chief security coordinator standing near the heavy iron handles of the oak doors. "It is time," I instructed, my voice sharp and clear. "Open them." The security officer signaled the quartet. The gentle classical music abruptly halted, replaced by a sudden heavy silence that instantly commanded the attention of the 300-seated guests. The immense oak doors standing 20 feet high swung open simultaneously with a deep, resonant groan that echoed through the cavernous conservatory. A brilliant column of concentrated white light precisely angled from the ceiling fixtures spilled through the threshold, illuminating the entry point. Every head in the room turned toward the doors. The wealthy investors leaned forward, expecting to see the arrogant developer and his glamorous bride. Chloe's socialite friends raised their hands instinctively, searching for the phones they no longer possessed, desperate to capture the grand entrance. They waited for Marcus and Chloe. Instead, Julian and I stepped into the blinding light. I did not march down the aisle with the hesitant, emotional gait of a traditional bride. I walked with the measured, predatory cadence of a corporate executive entering a hostile boardroom to announce a hostile takeover. Julian moved in perfect synchronization beside me, projecting a quiet, terrifying authority that instantly suffocated the ambient chatter in the room. The collective reaction was a masterpiece of cognitive failure. The transition from eager anticipation to profound, paralyzed confusion swept through the audience like a physical shockwave. The guests stared at us, their brains violently struggling to process the impossible visual data. This was not the couple printed on the gold-embossed invitations. This was not the man who had pitched them multi-million-dollar real estate ventures, nor was it the woman who had dominated their social media feeds with frantic wedding updates. A heavy, suffocating silence slammed down upon the conservatory. The investors' sharp-minded individuals trained to detect anomalies exchanged rapid, bewildered glances. The sudden realization that they had been deliberately diverted, that they had surrendered their communication devices, and marched blindly into an unknown, unverified event, triggered a deep, primal unease. They recognized the tactical disadvantage of their position, sensing the distinct, chilling atmosphere of a highly orchestrated ambush. But the most spectacular, devastating reaction erupted from the very front row. My parents, Richard and Patricia, had been escorted to the prime family seating area moments before the doors opened. They had settled into the plush velvet chairs brimming with arrogant pride, eager to bask in the reflected glory of their golden child's triumph. They expected to watch Chloe secure their financial salvation and elevate their social standing. When I stepped through those doors, the blood instantaneously drained from their faces, leaving their skin a sickly ashen gray. Patricia let out a strangled, breathless gasp, her hands flying to her throat as if the oxygen had been violently sucked from the room. Her eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror, darting frantically from my stark silk gown to the imposing figure of Julian standing beside me. Richard, his face contorting into a mask of furious, panicked realization, gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. He understood the implications immediately. He knew the venue had been switched. He knew I was supposed to be a defeated, sidelined casualty. Seeing me command the center stage, flanked by elite security personnel, shattered his entire fabricated reality. The patriarch who had constantly belittled my career and demanded my submission attempted to reassert his dominance. Richard planted his feet and violently shoved himself upward, preparing to scream to demand answers to forcibly halt the procession and reclaim control of the narrative. He never made it past a half-crouch. Before Richard could fully stand or utter a single syllable, two massive security contractors materialized from the shadows flanking the front row. They moved with terrifying, silent efficiency. One operative clamped a heavy, unyielding hand down hard on Richard's shoulder, physically forcing him back into the velvet seat with bruising force. The second operative positioned himself directly behind Patricia. His presence, a dark, imposing threat that instantly paralyzed her. "Sir," the operative behind Richard murmured, his voice a low, lethal warning designed to be heard only by my parents. "You will remain seated and absolutely silent for the duration of this presentation. Any attempt to disrupt the proceedings will be interpreted as a hostile action, and you will be physically removed from the premises. Do you understand?" Richard stared up at the operative, his jaw trembling, his arrogant bluster completely pulverized by the immediate threat of physical restraint. Patricia whimpered, shrinking back into her chair, her manicured hands shaking violently in her lap. They were trapped immobilized in the front row, forced to bear witness to the total annihilation of their empire. I continued my slow, deliberate march down the marble aisle, ignoring the frantic whispers and the terrified stares of the captive audience. I did not look at my parents. They were entirely irrelevant now, reduced to powerless spectators in a room they thought they controlled. I kept my gaze locked straight ahead, focusing on the elevated podium standing at the end of the aisle. The coup was officially underway. The audience was secured, the targets were contained, and the federal authorities were racing toward our location. All that remained was the systematic public execution of Marcus's fraudulent kingdom, an exposure so absolute it would leave scorched earth in its wake. I stepped up to the podium, leaving Julian to guard the flank, and reached for the microphone. The true ceremony was about to begin, and it required no vows, only undeniable catastrophic truth. While the grand conservatory settled into a suffocating, terrified silence under my command, a radically different psychological breakdown was erupting roughly 200 yards away. Isolated in the opulent annex suite, Chloe and Marcus were actively spiraling into total systemic failure. The soundproof walls of the holding room successfully masked the audible shockwave of my entrance in the main hall, leaving the couple trapped in an agonizing vacuum of information. Initially, they had lounged on the plush leather sofas, drinking the provided vintage champagne, fully convinced they were the undisputed royalty of the event. They anticipated the arrival of an obsequious event coordinator, ready to usher them toward the spotlight, where they would graciously accept the adoration of the elite crowd. But the minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The heavily tinted windows offered no view of the estate grounds, and the thick mahogany door remained resolutely shut. Chloe checked her reflection in the gilded mirror for the 5th time, adjusting the neckline of her extravagant, heavily beaded gown. The dress, purchased entirely on fraudulent credit, weighed heavily on her frame. She paced the length of the room, her designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. "Where are they?" Chloe snapped, her voice pitching upward in irritation, the pristine facade cracking to reveal the anxious narcissist beneath. The string quartet started playing 20 minutes ago. I could feel the bass vibrating through the floorboards before it stopped. They are ruining the timing of my entrance. The lighting won't be optimal if we wait much longer. Marcus did not answer immediately. He was standing near the center of the room, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He wore a custom tuxedo, the fabric impeccably tailored to project the image of a titan of industry. Yet beneath the expensive wool, his skin crawled with an icy, creeping dread. The absence of his smartphone was inducing a severe psychological withdrawal. A con artist relies on constant communication, the ability to spin narratives, monitor incoming funds, and manipulate targets in real time. Without his digital tether, Marcus was flying blind in a storm he had manufactured. He needed to verify the insurance claim filed earlier that morning. He needed to ensure the black market contractor who sabotaged the conservatory was staying quiet. Most importantly, he needed to monitor the angel investors arriving at the estate, ensuring his multi-million-dollar lifeline remained secure. "This is highly unprofessional," Marcus muttered, his tone attempting to mask his rising panic with authoritative indignation. He marched toward the heavy mahogany door, fully intending to berate whatever unfortunate staff member was stationed outside. "You cannot lock the primary investors in a holding pattern. It kills the momentum of the pitch." He grabbed the ornate brass handle and pulled. The door did not yield. Marcus frowned, his grip tightening. He pulled harder, putting his shoulder into the motion. The heavy wood remained entirely immovable, secured by a solid, unyielding resistance. He twisted the handle violently, the metal mechanism clattering uselessly against the internal electronic lock. "Hey," Marcus shouted, slamming his open palm against the thick wood. "Open this door immediately. We have a schedule to maintain." Only dead silence answered him. The realization struck Marcus with the physical force of a blow to the chest. This was not a logistical delay. This was a deliberate containment. He spun around, his eyes darting frantically across the lavishly appointed room. He registered the reinforced hinges on the door, the absence of landline telephones, the heavily tinted shatterproof glass of the windows. He was not resting in a VIP lounge. He had willingly walked into a customized high-security quarantine zone. "What is going on?" Chloe demanded, her voice shrill, sensing the sudden shift in his demeanor. "Why won't it open? Marcus, tell them to open the door." Marcus ignored her, lunging toward the small, reinforced window panel set into the door. He peered through the thick glass, expecting to see a disorganized event staff. Instead, he saw 2 massive security contractors standing shoulder to shoulder in the corridor. They wore dark tactical gear, their posture rigid, completely ignoring his frantic movements. "Open the door!" Marcus roared, abandoning any pretense of sophisticated calm. He hammered his fists against the reinforced glass, the sound dull and muffled by the soundproofing. "I have half the city council sitting in that ballroom. If you do not let me out right now, I will ensure the security firm never works in this state again." The contractors did not even turn their heads. They remained as immobile as statues following strict protocols designed to isolate the targets. Chloe finally grasped the severity of the situation. Her entitlement evaporated instantly, replaced by raw, unadulterated hysteria. She rushed to the door, pushing Marcus aside. She beat her hands against the wood, her diamond rings scratching the polished surface. "Help!" Chloe shrieked, her voice tearing at her throat. "Somebody help us! They locked us in! My dress is getting ruined! Call the police!" Marcus stumbled backward, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He pressed his back against the wall, sliding down until he hit the floor. He gripped his hair, pulling at the roots as his mind spun wildly out of control. The grand illusion he had painstakingly maintained for 2 years was violently collapsing around him. He was trapped. He could not check his offshore holding accounts to see if the creditors had already initiated the seizure protocols. He could not contact the insurance adjuster to verify the $2 million payout that was supposed to save him from federal prison. And then a far more terrifying realization eclipsed his financial panic. The investors. The 30 high-net-worth individuals he had desperately lured to this estate, the men and women holding the $5 million he required to survive, were sitting in the main hall. They were entirely isolated from him, completely outside his sphere of influence. And who was in control of that main hall? Harper, the woman he had attempted to financially bleed at the steakhouse, the woman he had mocked and threatened with a public smear campaign, the crisis manager who made her living dismantling corporate scandals and burying adversaries. He had orchestrated the destruction of her wedding venue, forced her parents to demand her submission, and confidently marched his targets into her domain, assuming she would quietly bow to family pressure. He had handed the undisputed master of crisis management a captive audience consisting entirely of his marks. "She knows," Marcus whispered the words barely escaping his lips. His face turned a sickly, translucent white. The sheer magnitude of his miscalculation paralyzed his nervous system. She set this up. The security, the phone confiscation, the estate. It was a trap. She knows everything. Chloe stopped beating on the door, turning slowly to look at him. Her mascara was smeared, her elaborate updo unraveling. "What are you talking about?" Chloe demanded, her voice shaking with terror. "What does she know, Marcus? What did you do?" He did not answer her. He pulled his knees to his chest, rocking back and forth on the expensive rug. The arrogant real estate developer had vanished, replaced by a terrified criminal, realizing the federal authorities were likely already deciphering his ledgers. The quarantine was not merely a psychological torture tactic designed to break their spirits. It served a highly specific tactical purpose. By confiscating their devices and locking them in the annex, Julian and I ensured they could not initiate a remote data wipe. They could not access their cloud servers to delete the fraudulent vendor invoices or the offshore routing numbers. They could not warn their accomplices or attempt to transfer the remaining stolen funds into cryptocurrency wallets. They were digitally neutralized, preserved perfectly, in a state of suspended animation, while the federal machinery rapidly closed the distance. The Federal Bureau of Investigation Cybercrimes Unit required an untainted digital environment to execute the seizure warrants, and we had delivered it to them flawlessly. While Chloe continued to hurl herself against the unyielding mahogany door, screaming until her voice gave out, Marcus remained on the floor, drowning in the inescapable reality of his destruction. They were trapped in a box, entirely isolated, while I stood at the podium in the main hall, ready to project their ruin onto a massive screen for the entire world to see. The contrast was absolute, and the execution was about to commence. The hushed murmurs of the 300 captive guests provided a surreal backdrop as Julian and I stood before the officiant at the elevated altar. The opulent conservatory, bathed in the soft, filtered light of the morning sun, contrasted sharply with the devastating operational strike we were currently executing. I did not gaze out at the audience during the ceremony. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Julian. Our vows were brief, devoid of the flowery, manufactured sentimentality that typically characterizes high society spectacles. They were practical, grounded in mutual respect and absolute, unwavering loyalty. Julian spoke of building impenetrable defenses and standing as a unified front against external threats. I vowed to navigate crises with precision, ensuring our shared foundation remained eternally secure. To the uninitiated ears in the pews, it sounded like a modern, pragmatic declaration of love. To us, it was the formal ratification of a lifelong tactical alliance. The officiant pronounced us married. Julian leaned in, pressing a firm, brief kiss to my lips. It was a seal on the contract, a moment of genuine connection amidst the escalating warfare. The string quartet, waiting for their cue, prepared to launch into a triumphant recessional melody. The audience shifted in their velvet seats, raising their hands, anticipating the polite, obligatory applause that signals the end of the formalities and the commencement of the reception. They expected me to take Julian's arm and glide gracefully back down the marble aisle, disappearing into the background while the event transitioned into the networking summit Marcus had promised them. I did not move. I turned away from Julian, reaching out to the officiant. I grasped the wireless microphone from his hands with a smooth, practiced motion. The sudden, amplified rustle of the microphone handling echoed sharply through the cavernous space. The string quartet aborted their cue, their bows hovering frozen over their instruments. The anticipated applause died, instantly replaced by a dense, palpable confusion. I turned to face the audience, stepping up to the very edge of the elevated platform. I looked down at the sea of tailored suits and designer gowns. I saw the prominent venture capitalists, the local politicians, and the angel investors Marcus had desperately lured to this location. I saw my parents in the front row, rigidly pinned in place by the imposing security contractors standing directly behind their chairs. Richard's face was an unhealthy, mottled crimson. Patricia was visibly trembling, clutching her evening bag as if it were a life preserver. "Thank you all for attending my wedding today," I announced, my voice carrying clear and sharp across the silent conservatory. It lacked any trace of bridal warmth. It was the precise, modulated tone I utilized during hostile press conferences. The investors in the front rows exchanged perplexed glances. They had been invited to celebrate the union of Marcus and Chloe. The sudden realization that they were attending an entirely different event, hosted by the crisis manager, they had been told to ignore, created a visible ripple of unease. They adjusted their posture, sensing a significant disruption in the corporate narrative. I am aware that many of you did not anticipate seeing me at this altar. I continued pacing slowly across the stage, maintaining intense, unbroken eye contact with the high-net-worth individuals Marcus had targeted. I am also acutely aware that several of you arrived today carrying substantial financial commitments, prepared to execute multi-million-dollar investment checks intended for a specific real estate development portfolio managed by my sister's fiancé, Marcus. A sharp intake of breath hissed from the second row. A prominent real estate tycoon, a man known for his ruthless acquisition strategies, sat up perfectly straight, his eyes narrowing in sudden, intense scrutiny. He recognized the tone. This was not a wedding speech. This was an executive briefing. As a professional crisis communications director, my primary function is the identification, isolation, and neutralization of catastrophic liabilities, I stated, my voice echoing off the glass-vaulted ceiling. And as the host of this private gathering, I consider the protection of my guests' financial assets to be my absolute paramount responsibility. Therefore, before you commit a single dollar to that development portfolio, I am ethically and legally obligated to provide you with a full, unredacted risk assessment. I did not wait for their murmurs to escalate into vocal protests. I raised my left hand, executing a sharp, predefined signal toward the elevated audiovisual control booth located at the rear of the hall. The heavy motorized rigging hidden within the ceiling architecture whirred to life. A massive high-definition projection screen descended rapidly, dropping directly behind the altar, spanning 20 feet across. The sudden movement commanded the entire room's attention. The investors braced themselves, expecting perhaps a lavish promotional video detailing Marcus's upcoming high-rise projects. The projector flared a blinding white, then instantly snapped into razor-sharp focus. It was not a promotional video. The screen displayed a massive, highly detailed financial flowchart. The background was stark black, and the data nodes were illuminated in a glaring, undeniable crimson red. Julian had designed the graphics specifically for immediate, visceral comprehension. The audience, composed largely of seasoned financial professionals, did not need a prolonged explanation to decipher the data architecture. They recognized a forensic audit the second it hit the screen. What you are currently viewing is the verified internal ledger for Marcus's primary holding firm, I declared, pivoting slightly to gesture toward the massive display. The documents clearly illustrate a comprehensive network of 12 distinct shell companies registered across multiple decentralized jurisdictions. I tapped a remote control concealed in my palm. The flowchart animated tracing thick red lines representing capital movement. Please note the incoming revenue streams I instructed, highlighting the left side of the screen. You will see initial capital injections from several individuals seated in this very room, categorized under early round seed funding for urban development projects. Now observe the disbursement routing. The red lines did not flow toward construction firms, architectural contractors, or municipal permit offices. They bypassed legitimate operational expenses entirely. The lines routed violently inward, looping back upon themselves in a chaotic, dizzying pattern. The capital was not deployed for development, I stated, the cold facts dropping like anvils into the silent room. A fraction of the incoming funds was immediately siphoned off and redistributed to the initial investors, falsely categorized as early dividend returns, to manufacture the illusion of high-yield profitability. A prominent hedge fund manager in the third row let out a low, strangled curse, recognizing the exact mechanical structure of the fraud. "It is a textbook Ponzi scheme," I announced, confirming the dread rapidly spreading through the audience. I clicked the remote again. The screen zoomed in, highlighting the final terminal destination of the remaining capital. The numbers were staggering. Millions of dollars had been systematically drained from the corporate shell network. The remaining capital did not remain in domestic accounts. I continued, my voice relentless. The funds were converted via offshore cryptocurrency exchanges and routed directly into high-stakes, unregulated offshore gambling syndicates. He did not build high-rises. He lost your money at virtual baccarat tables and sports betting terminals in Macau and the Cayman Islands. The room erupted. The polite, constrained decorum of the high society gathering shattered instantly. The investors, men and women who aggressively managed billion-dollar portfolios, leaped to their feet. Shouts of outrage, betrayal, and demands for immediate legal representation drowned out the string quartet. A venture capitalist who had personally vouched for Marcus slammed his fist onto the back of a velvet pew, his face purple with fury. They were not merely angry, they were terrified. They realized they had been publicly exposed as victims of a crude, devastating financial scam. The humiliation of being conned was almost as potent as the loss of capital. They pulled out the thick envelopes containing their investment checks, staring at the paper with absolute revulsion, realizing they had been mere minutes away from handing over millions to a degenerate gambler. In the front row, the catastrophic reality finally crushed my parents. Richard stared at the massive red ledger on the screen, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. The corporate jargon and the undeniable banking routes displayed above him eradicated his last shred of denial. He had not secured a brilliant, wealthy son-in-law. He had willingly leveraged his entire familial estate to underwrite a federal criminal. Patricia slumped sideways in her chair, a low, pathetic moan escaping her throat. She gripped Richard's arm, her manicured nails digging into the fabric of his suit. She looked up at the screen, then at the furious, shouting billionaires surrounding them. The elite social circle she had spent her entire life trying to infiltrate was currently transforming into a hostile mob, and she was sitting squarely in the blast radius of the man who had defrauded them. I stood at the podium watching the chaos unfold with absolute, unyielding calm. The financial execution was complete. The investors were securing their assets, and Marcus's funding lifeline was permanently severed. But a Ponzi scheme was merely white-collar crime. I needed to ensure the authorities treated Marcus not just as a fraudster, but as a dangerous, volatile threat to public safety. I needed to introduce the felony destruction of property. I raised the microphone, preparing to silence the room one final time and deliver the kill shot. The uproar inside the Grand Conservatory reached a fever pitch. A prominent tech venture capitalist in the third row, his face flushed with unadulterated fury, actively tore a pre-written investment check into tiny shreds, letting the confetti fall onto the marble floor. Beside him, an aggressive corporate litigator was already speed-dialing his firm on a smuggled smartwatch, shouting directives to initiate emergency asset freezes against Marcus's phantom portfolio. The elite audience, men and women who dictated the financial pulse of the city, had transformed into an angry, chaotic tribunal. They felt the sting of public humiliation, recognizing that their presence was utilized merely as set dressing for a spectacular con. I did not allow the pandemonium to dictate the pacing. I needed absolute silence to deliver the final, most devastating layer of evidence. I raised my hand, executing a sharp vertical slicing motion toward the audiovisual booth. Julian anticipated the command flawlessly. A piercing high-decibel feedback loop blared suddenly through the surround sound system, a sharp electronic screech that forced the shouting executives to cover their ears and flinch in surprise. The abrasive noise sliced through the hysteria, instantly resetting the room to a stunned, breathless quiet. I leaned back into the microphone, my voice a cold, unyielding anchor in the storm. "Do not miscalculate the severity of the situation," I stated, staring down the agitated crowd. "Financial fraud is merely a symptom of his desperation. Marcus did not invite you here today to celebrate a union, and he certainly did not invite you to offer a legitimate investment opportunity. You were lured to this location to serve as a glamorous distraction while he executed a felony extortion scheme against his insurance providers." I pressed the remote in my palm. The massive projection screen behind me shifted from the glaring red financial ledgers to a stark black audio waveform interface. Last night, I continued my words, echoing relentlessly the original venue for this event, the historic Botanical Conservatory, suffered catastrophic flooding. Authorities believed a high-pressure suppression main ruptured spontaneously. It was not a spontaneous failure. I clicked the final trigger. The crisp, digitally enhanced audio recording obtained from Julian's covert surveillance device flooded the conservatory. The speakers calibrated for a full symphony orchestra broadcast Marcus and Chloe's voices with chilling, unmistakable clarity. Marcus's cold, calculating tone filled the silent room. The investors backed out Chloe. The recording blared. "The seed capital we needed to bridge the gap is gone. The private lenders are preparing to file the seizure motions on Monday morning. If we host this reception and walk away with nothing but envelopes full of gift cards, I am bankrupt and your parents lose the house." A synchronized gasp rippled through the audience. Hearing the deception laid bare in his own voice, casually discussing their financial ruin, paralyzed the investors. Chloe's whining, panicked response followed immediately. "What are you saying, Marcus? We cannot just cancel. My friends are flying in. The press is expecting a spectacle. We will be ruined socially." Then came the kill shot. The audio captured Marcus outlining the arson plot with sociopathic precision. "We are not canceling it," he declared on the tape. "We are going to let a catastrophic act of God cancel it for us. I hired a contractor. He hits the main line at 11. The flood triggers the $2 million cancellation payout. We take the cash, hijack your sister's private venue using the family emergency excuse, and secure the investors tomorrow. We leave with the money and the audience." I severed the audio playback abruptly. The sudden absence of sound was heavier than a physical blow. "He intended to use the $5 million you brought today to pacify his immediate violent creditors," I announced, ensuring every single guest grasped the lethal reality. "And he planned to use the $2 million obtained through criminal property destruction to secure his permanent escape, leaving the complete financial fallout squarely on the shoulders of the guarantors who underwrote his loans." I turned my gaze away from the bewildered investors and locked it entirely onto the front row. I looked directly at my father. Richard sat frozen, his breath hitching in ragged, erratic gasps. The blood had entirely abandoned his face, leaving a sickly, translucent pallor. The magnitude of his foolishness, the catastrophic consequences of his blind, unwavering favoritism, finally crushed the denial from his mind. He had not merely co-signed a loan for a struggling entrepreneur. He had legally bound his entire familial estate, his retirement, and his life's work as collateral for a man actively engaged in organized crime and federal insurance fraud. He realized in that agonizing moment that when the authorities inevitably seized Marcus's assets, the legal liability would transfer directly to the guarantors. The bank would not negotiate. The federal government would not offer a reprieve. They would foreclose on the sprawling mansion he valued above his own daughter's respect. They would liquidate his accounts. He was about to be rendered entirely publicly destitute. A guttural, choked sound escaped Richard's throat. He reached out a trembling hand, gripping the edge of the velvet pew for support, but his legs failed him. He slid awkwardly from the chair, his knees hitting the marble floor with a dull thud. He collapsed forward, his hands clutching desperately at his chest, his eyes wide with an incomprehensible terror as he stared up at the massive, damning screen. Patricia shrieked a high-pitched, frantic wail that shattered the lingering silence. She threw herself onto the floor beside him, abandoning all pretense of high society decorum. She tore at the collar of his suit, screaming for a doctor, her pristine facade entirely obliterated by the realization that her luxurious world was burning to ash right before her eyes. The elite social circle she had spent her life cultivating watched her frantic display with profound, disgusted detachment. No one rushed forward to assist her. The wealthy guests physically backed away, widening the perimeter around my parents as if they were a contagious threat. They recognized that interacting with the guarantors of a massive federal fraud scheme was corporate suicide. Patricia was completely isolated in her ruin, screaming for an audience that had unequivocally turned its back on her. I stood at the podium observing the total, undeniable implosion of my family's fabricated empire. The meticulous planning, the sleepless nights spent analyzing financial ledgers and tracking encrypted communications had culminated in this exact, flawless execution. The truth had not merely been exposed, it had been weaponized with surgical precision. The elaborate lie they had constructed to marginalize me and elevate Chloe was effectively dismantled, reduced to a pile of legal liabilities and public humiliation. But the operation was not quite complete. While my parents wallowed in their self-inflicted destruction, the primary targets remained locked in the annex, unaware that the federal authorities, tipped off by our initial data dump, were currently breaching the outer gates of the estate, ready to collect their prize. The spectacle of my father collapsed on the marble, gasping for breath, while Patricia shrieked for assistance was abruptly interrupted by a loud, violent commotion at the rear of the conservatory. The heavy oak doors, which had remained securely shut since my entrance, were shoved open with chaotic force. The security contractors, having received Julian's precise digital authorization to release the containment hold, stepped aside. Marcus and Chloe burst into the grand hall, practically stumbling over each other in their frantic haste. They arrived fully prepared to execute a hysterical, victimized performance. Chloe's makeup was dramatically smudged, her elaborate gown deliberately disordered to project the image of a traumatized bride who had endured inexplicable captivity. Marcus trailed closely behind, his jaw set in a mask of righteous indignation, ready to loudly threaten lawsuits and demand the immediate removal of whoever dared to delay his vital networking summit. They charged down the center aisle, expecting to find an audience of sympathetic, wealthy investors murmuring in concern over their sudden disappearance. They intended to weaponize the confusion, blaming a severe security malfunction, and seamlessly transition into their fraudulent pitch. Their momentum lasted exactly 3 seconds. As they stormed past the final row of pews, Marcus halted so abruptly his expensive leather shoes skidded against the polished floor. The aggressive tirade died instantly in his throat. Chloe, failing to register his sudden stop, collided heavily against his back, nearly knocking them both over. They looked up, expecting to command the room. Instead, they were met with the massive, glowing projection screen towering above the altar. The stark, undeniable audio waveform of their criminal conspiracy was still frozen on the display, looming over them like an inescapable digital executioner. Marcus's eyes widened, absorbing the catastrophic reality of the image. He then swept his gaze across the audience he had so desperately coveted. The investors were not seated politely awaiting an explanation. They were standing in a rigid, unified front, their expressions hardened into masks of pure, unadulterated hostility. The wealthy targets he sought to exploit were staring at him with the lethal, predatory intensity of financial titans who realized they had almost been scammed by an amateur. The silence stretching between the exposed fraudsters and the enraged crowd was thick, oppressive, and heavily loaded with impending ruin. Chloe finally registered the frozen projection screen. She recognized the time-stamped audio file. Her hands flew to her mouth, stifling a horrified gasp as the impossible truth shattered her meticulously constructed delusion. She slowly turned her head, looking past the hostile investors, past her weeping mother on the floor, and locked eyes directly with me, standing at the elevated podium. I did not offer a smug smile. I offered a terrifying, empty stare. I let her see the absolute void where her sister used to be. The sheer suffocating gravity of the situation triggered an immediate primal reaction within the cornered couple. There was no unified front, no desperate attempt to deny the evidence together. The fraudulent alliance built on mutual narcissism instantly fractured under the immense pressure of federal exposure. The instinct for self-preservation violently overrode any remaining pretense of loyalty. "You set me up!" Marcus roared, the polished facade of the affluent developer completely dissolving into raw, frantic panic. He did not yell at me. He violently spun around, pointing a shaking accusatory finger directly in Chloe's face. The sudden vicious attack on his own bride shocked the audience. The polite restraint of the room evaporated as the crowd braced for the implosion. "This was your fault!" Marcus bellowed, his voice cracking spit flying from his lips as he aggressively backed Chloe against a row of empty chairs. "I told you we could not afford this spectacle. I told you the lenders were closing in. You demanded the botanical conservatory. You demanded the imported orchids and the five-star catering. You bled the operating accounts dry to fund your ridiculous influencer lifestyle, and you forced me to find the cash." Chloe stumbled backward, her face contorting in genuine terrified disbelief. She stared at the man she had proudly flaunted on social media, the man she believed elevated her above me, currently blaming her for a federal crime. "You are a liar!" Chloe shrieked, her voice a high-pitched, hysterical wail that echoed painfully through the conservatory. "You promised me we had millions in offshore accounts. You said the investors were practically begging to give you money. You told me the arson was a brilliant business maneuver to secure our future. You dragged me into this. You greedy, superficial parasite." Marcus spat back his rage entirely unchecked. He waved his arms wildly, gesturing to her extravagant beaded gown. "You never cared about the business. You only cared about looking richer than your sister. I committed wire fraud just to pay your credit card bills. I ruined my life to keep you in designer shoes." The sheer cowardice on display was breathtaking. Faced with decades in federal prison, the arrogant developer was actively attempting to shift the entire burden of guilt onto his financially illiterate bride in front of 300 witnesses. Chloe's terror rapidly mutated into violent, unhinged fury. She let out a guttural scream, lunging forward with her hands raised. She swung a desperate, open-palmed slap that connected brutally with the side of Marcus's face. The sharp, resounding smack echoed loudly, snapping his head to the side. Marcus staggered, clutching his reddening cheek shock, momentarily overriding his panic. Before he could retaliate, Julian signaled the security contractors. 4 operatives moved swiftly from the perimeter, physically intervening to separate the brawling couple. They grabbed Marcus by the arms, restraining his frantic movements, while another operative firmly corralled Chloe away from the aisle, restrained and hyperventilating. Chloe frantically searched the room for a lifeline. Her eyes darted toward the front row, seeking the unconditional protection she had relied upon her entire life. She spotted Richard collapsed on the floor, clutching his chest, with Patricia kneeling beside him. Mom, Chloe sobbed, straining against the security operative's hold. "Mom, tell them he is lying. Tell them Marcus forced me into this. You have to call our lawyers. You have to fix this. Please, Mom, they are going to arrest me." Patricia slowly lifted her head. Her perfectly styled hair was a disheveled mess, her expensive makeup ruined by a stream of terrified tears. She looked at her golden child, the daughter she had elevated at my expense, the daughter who had just unwittingly helped a con artist mortgage their family estate to the brink of foreclosure. Patricia did not rush to comfort her. She did not offer reassurances of legal protection. The matriarch who had confidently demanded I surrender my wedding venue just hours prior now sat completely broken on the marble floor. She looked at Chloe, and then she looked up at the glowing projection screen displaying the undeniable proof of their total financial ruin. "We have nothing," Patricia whispered, her voice a hollow, haunting rasp that carried surprisingly far in the sudden quiet of the room. Her eyes were completely vacant, stripped of all arrogance. "We signed the guarantee, Chloe. The house, the retirement accounts. Everything is gone. There are no lawyers left to call." Chloe stopped struggling. The realization hit her with devastating finality. The protective bubble of her parents' wealth, the safety net that had always shielded her from consequences, was entirely eradicated. She was completely exposed, standing in a ruined wedding gown, facing the undeniable reality that she was bound to a criminal and entirely destitute. The high society audience watched the pathetic display with profound revulsion. They had not just witnessed the exposure of a financial fraud. They had witnessed the grotesque unraveling of a family built entirely on lies, greed, and toxic favoritism. They murmured in disgusted disbelief, appalled by the sheer cowardice of the groom and the pathetic desperation of the bride. I remained at the podium, a silent sentinel overseeing the wreckage. I did not need to utter another word. They had done the work for me. They had ripped their own masks off, exposing the ugly, rotting core of their existence to the very people they desperately sought to impress. But the public humiliation and internal betrayal were merely the prelude. The consequences I had orchestrated extended far beyond social ruin. The financial data Julian had transmitted earlier that morning had successfully navigated the federal bureaucracy. The authorities had verified the offshore routing numbers and authenticated the arson conspiracy recording. As Chloe sank to the floor, weeping uncontrollably into her hands, and Marcus continued to shout frantic, useless denials at the security contractors restraining him, a new sound pierced the heavy atmosphere of the conservatory. It started as a faint, distant wail echoing from the main access road, growing rapidly louder and more insistent by the second. The distinctive, aggressive blare of multiple emergency sirens signaled the arrival of the final, inescapable reality. The federal strike team was officially on site, and the ultimate reckoning was imminent. The wail of approaching sirens grew from a distant echo into a deafening roar, reverberating through the glass ceiling of the conservatory. The sound broke the paralysis holding Marcus. Pure, unfiltered adrenaline flooded his system. He realized the private security contractors standing nearby were not merely preventing a brawl, they were detaining him for law enforcement. With a sudden, desperate surge of strength, he wrenched his arm free from the operative's grip. He shoved the contractor backward, his tailored tuxedo jacket ripping at the shoulder seam. Marcus did not look back at his weeping bride or his terrified in-laws. He bolted. He sprinted down the center aisle, his expensive leather shoes slipping erratically against the polished marble, aiming straight for the grand entrance. He thought he could reach the perimeter, vanish into the wooded hills, and somehow outrun the digital paper trail. He never made it halfway. Before Marcus could reach the threshold, the towering oak doors were thrust open with bone-rattling force. The sunlight pouring into the venue was instantly eclipsed by a highly synchronized wave of dark tactical gear. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had breached the estate. Over a dozen agents flooded the entrance, their movements swift and terrifyingly precise. The bright yellow letters emblazoned across their windbreakers provided a jarring contrast to the delicate white orchids lining the aisle. Accompanying the tactical unit were plainclothes investigators from the Securities and Exchange Commission, clutching thick sealed folders containing the warrants Julian and I had engineered. Marcus skidded to a halt, his eyes widening as the wall of federal authority advanced. He raised his hands, a frantic excuse dying in his throat, but the lead FBI agent did not pause to negotiate. The agent closed the distance in 3 rapid strides, grabbed Marcus by the lapels of his ruined tuxedo, and drove him forcefully toward the floor. The impact was loud and unyielding. Marcus hit the marble face first, a sharp gasp punching out of his lungs. 2 more agents descended upon him, pinning his arms securely behind his back. The cold metallic click of steel handcuffs ratcheting tight around his wrists echoed clearly over the stunned whispers of the audience. The arrogant developer who had confidently planned to steal millions and hijack my life was reduced to a squirming, pathetic pile on the floor. He began to weep. It was not a dignified, silent surrender. It was a loud, messy display of cowardice. He sobbed into the marble, begging the federal agents for a deal, claiming he could name bigger players, offering up anyone and everyone to save his own skin. The lead agent ignored his bargaining, hauling him upward by the restricted arms and reciting his Miranda rights in a voice devoid of an ounce of sympathy. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, interstate extortion, and arson." The agent declared, his tone cutting through the ambient noise like a blade. Watching her husband dragged to his feet in iron restraints shattered the last fragile remnant of Chloe's reality. Her elaborate beaded gown was tangled around her knees. Her hair hung in messy, unspooled strands. She scrambled away from the center aisle, crawling desperately toward the front row. "Mom," she screamed, her voice hoarse and raw. "Dad, tell them to stop. Call the lawyers. Fix this. They are making a mistake. You have to fix this." She reached out her trembling fingers, grasping at the fabric of my father's trousers, seeking the unconditional rescue that had defined her entire existence. Richard tried to kick his leg free from her grip, his own panic superseding his parental instincts. He looked at the approaching agents, raising his hands in a frantic gesture of surrender. "We have nothing to do with him," Richard stammered, stepping back and physically distancing himself from his weeping daughter. "We are victims here. He lied to us. We did not know about the fraudulent accounts. We are prominent members of this community. We demand to speak to our attorneys." A senior investigator from the Securities and Exchange Commission stepped out from behind the FBI perimeter. She was a tall, imposing woman who held a clipboard with lethal intent. She walked directly up to Richard, unbothered by his attempts to leverage his fading social status. She did not offer a sympathetic nod. "You are Richard and Patricia," the investigator stated, checking the names against a printed warrant. "The parents of the bride." "Yes," Patricia gasped, climbing unsteadily to her feet. "We are victims of his deception. We thought he was a legitimate developer. We trusted him." The investigator flipped a page on her clipboard, retrieving 2 heavy sealed envelopes. She thrust them directly against Richard's chest, forcing him to take them. "Ignorance of his operational mechanics does not invalidate your signatures on his commercial debt instruments," the investigator explained, her voice carrying a chilling, bureaucratic finality. "You willfully signed as the primary financial guarantors for 3 separate predatory bridge loans to keep his shell companies afloat. When his fraudulent network collapsed this morning, the liability transferred instantly to you." Richard stared at the envelopes, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped them. "What are you saying?" he whispered, the remaining color draining from his lips. "I am serving you with immediate federally mandated asset freeze orders," the investigator replied. "As of this exact moment, every single bank account registered to your names has been seized, pending a full federal audit. Your investment portfolios are locked. The deed to your primary residence has been flagged for federal forfeiture to satisfy the outstanding debt obligations incurred by your son-in-law. You possess 0 liquid capital. You are effectively bankrupt, and your home is now an active crime scene." Patricia let out a sound that barely resembled a human voice. It was a hollow, strangled wheeze. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed back into the velvet pew. The elite country club lifestyle she had lorded over me, the arrogant superiority she wielded like a weapon, was legally and permanently eradicated in less than a minute. She was staring at a future of profound destitution, stripped of the wealth she used to demand obedience. Richard stood paralyzed, the legal documents trembling in his hands. He looked around the room, making frantic eye contact with the wealthy venture capitalists and politicians he had invited. He silently pleaded for intervention, for a colleague to step forward and offer a financial lifeline. The response was a masterclass in corporate self-preservation. The billionaires and executives simultaneously turned their backs. They checked their watches, gathered their coats, and began moving swiftly toward the exits, eager to distance their own reputations from the radioactive fallout of a federal sting operation. The social circle my parents worshipped had collectively abandoned them to the wolves. I stood at the elevated podium, the microphone resting silently on the wooden surface. Julian stood a half-step behind me, a silent, immovable guardian. I crossed my arms, observing the sprawling wreckage of the family that had tried to bury me. The event they had maliciously hijacked to humiliate me, the wedding date they stole to assert their dominance, had transformed into the flawless, inescapable stage for their own destruction. The payoff was brilliant, explosive, and rooted entirely in unassailable legal logic. They had handed me the ropes, and I had simply tied the knot. I watched the FBI agents march Marcus down the marble aisle, his head bowed, his tears staining his ruined collar. I watched my mother weeping on the floor, clutching a useless designer purse, while my father stared blankly at the federal warrants that just erased his legacy. I felt no pity. I felt no sorrow. I felt only the clean, sharp air of absolute liberation. The predators had been caged, and the crisis was officially managed. The American justice system operates with a distinct grinding efficiency when processing high-profile, white-collar crime. It does not pause for country club pedigrees or carefully curated social media tiers. Once the federal indictments unsealed the illusion my family had guarded so fiercely, their empire was systematically dismantled inside a sterile, fluorescent-lit courtroom. Marcus attempted to leverage a plea deal offering to testify against phantom accomplices he claimed orchestrated the fraud. The prosecution, armed with the digital trail Julian had secured, refused to negotiate. They possessed the audio recordings, the offshore routing numbers, and the encrypted communications with the arsonist. Faced with an insurmountable mountain of evidence, the defense attorney simply stopped talking. The federal judge handed down a 15-year sentence in a maximum security penitentiary for wire fraud, securities manipulation, and conspiracy to commit insurance extortion. There would be no early parole hearings, no comfortable halfway house transition. Marcus traded his bespoke tailored suits for a standard-issue uniform, locked away in a concrete cell where his silver tongue held zero currency. My parents fared no better under the crushing weight of their financial guarantees. The Securities and Exchange Commission, tasked with recovering capital for the defrauded investors, executed a swift and total asset forfeiture. The sprawling suburban mansion, the crown jewel of my mother's pride, was seized, appraised, and sold at a public auction. The bank liquidated their retirement portfolios, emptying decades of savings to satisfy the debts Marcus had accumulated under their signatures. Richard and Patricia were evicted, carrying only the clothing that fit into a few cardboard boxes. They relocated to a cramped, poorly ventilated apartment in a decaying industrial neighborhood on the very edge of the city limits. The social exile was merciless. The elite friends they had spent their lives trying to impress severed all contact, erasing their numbers and looking the other way if they ever crossed paths on the street. My father, once a proud patriarch who dictated terms at steakhouse dinners, now spent his days staring at peeling wallpaper. My mother learned the harsh reality of clipping grocery coupons, permanently silenced by the consequences of her own hubris. The most poetic descent, however, belonged to Chloe. The golden child whose entire identity relied on outshining me found herself stripped of every luxury she had claimed as her birthright. Federal investigators seized the engagement ring, the designer wardrobe, and the vehicles, categorizing them as the illicit proceeds of a criminal enterprise. Without Marcus's stolen funds or our parents' financial safety net, she possessed no tangible skills and no viable work history. The high society circles that once attended her lavish parties treated her like a contagion, left with nothing but the immediate need for survival. Chloe was forced to enter the workforce at the very bottom of the economic ladder. Today she works the night shift as a sanitation attendant at a dying low-end shopping mall 2 towns over. She pushes a heavy cart filled with bleach and industrial cleaning supplies, scrubbing scuff marks off the faded linoleum while her former peers sleep in their secure estates. Her hands, once adorned with stolen diamonds, are cracked and dry from the harsh chemical detergents. During one of her shifts last month, a former bridesmaid recognized her emptying a food court trash can. Chloe turned her face away, hiding her flushed cheeks beneath the brim of a cheap baseball cap, pretending she did not hear her name called. She navigates the empty corridors under flickering lights, existing as a ghost in a retail graveyard, paying the ultimate price for her blinding narcissism. While their world burned to ash, my professional trajectory shifted into a stratosphere I had only previously imagined. The corporate sector does not keep secrets. News of the private estate takedown rippled through the executive suites of every major firm in the state. They heard the whispers of a crisis manager who had not just contained a scandal, but had masterminded the public execution of a monumental Ponzi scheme while wearing an ivory silk wedding gown. The narrative shifted my firm's reputation from highly competent to undeniably lethal. I was no longer just a public relations consultant. I was viewed as an apex tactician. Top-tier executives, billionaires facing hostile takeovers, and corporate boards navigating severe vulnerabilities lined up outside my glass office doors. During a recent intake meeting with a prominent pharmaceutical chief executive facing a severe stock plunge, he pushed a blank check across my desk, stating he wanted the woman who possessed the intellect and the nerve to orchestrate a federal raid at her own altar. My billing rates quadrupled overnight. My firm expanded across 3 time zones, absorbing smaller agencies to handle the influx of high-value clientele. We dictated our terms, choosing only the most complex, high-stakes battles. I had weaponized my trauma, transforming a lifelong family burden into an impenetrable corporate shield. The true victory was not found in the boardrooms or the expanding profit margins. It was found on the sun-drenched deck of a private chartered yacht, gliding smoothly across the Mediterranean Sea. Julian and I took our delayed honeymoon 2 months after the legal dust had settled. Far away from the sterile courtrooms and the frantic pace of the city, we navigated the azure waters off the Amalfi Coast. There were no invasive photographers, no toxic relatives demanding our attention, and no fabricated dramas to untangle. We spent our mornings drinking dark espresso while watching the horizon, and our evenings discussing secure algorithms and global market trends under the stars. The partnership we forged was rooted in unvarnished truth and an unbreakable mutual defense. Julian had stood by me when the fire was burning its hottest, utilizing his brilliant mind to hand me the digital sword I needed to slay the dragons of my past. We built a life where our actions spoke louder than any public performance, securing a future that no external force could ever breach. Standing at the teak railing, feeling the warm sea breeze against my face, I realized the ultimate lesson my family had inadvertently taught me. Arrogance is a fragile structure built on shifting sand. When you spend your life trying to extinguish someone else's light just to make your own spark seem brighter, you blind yourself to the danger lurking in the shadows. Never push a quiet, observant person into a corner. Never underestimate the resolve of someone who has learned to survive without a safety net. My sister stole my wedding date to prove she held the power, failing to understand that power is not a venue, a designer dress, or a captive audience. Power is the discipline to weight the intellect to gather the evidence and the cold, unyielding nerve to strike. Do not ever try to drown another person to keep yourself afloat, because you never know when they might be the one holding the match that burns your entire empire to the ground. As I stand here today looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office, the chaotic noise of my past is finally silent. The sprawling city below moves with a relentless rhythm, entirely indifferent to the fraudulent empire I dismantled. The family that spent 3 decades attempting to make me feel small ended up shrinking themselves into permanent, suffocating obscurity. Their desperate, ravenous need for the spotlight became the exact mechanism that exposed their criminal rot to the world. If traversing this exhausting battlefield has taught me anything, the first undeniable truth is that shared biology is not a binding contract for lifelong abuse. Society relentlessly conditions us to forgive toxic relatives, pressuring us to absorb their insults and finance their reckless mistakes under the false guise of family loyalty. But loyalty must be earned. When the people who are supposed to protect you view your hard-earned success merely as a disposable resource to exploit, severing that connection is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate necessary act of self-preservation. You owe absolutely nothing to those who actively scheme to orchestrate your downfall. The second lesson is the lethal, unparalleled effectiveness of complete silence. When confronted with narcissists and manipulators, basic human instinct demands that we scream back, defend our character, and engage in the public mudslinging. That reaction is exactly what they crave. They thrive on your emotional chaos because it distracts from cold facts. By refusing to engage with Chloe's digital smear campaign or my father's verbal intimidation, I starved them of their oxygen. Silence allowed my mind to remain a fortress. Let your enemies talk loudly. Let them brag to their peers and spin their elaborate lies. While they are busy performing for an imaginary audience, you can quietly gather the irrefutable evidence required to demolish their stage. The third and final lesson is that true power never needs to announce its presence. My family worshipped the hollow illusion of wealth. They genuinely believed that designer labels, hijacked wedding venues, and loud, aggressive boasts equated to invincibility. Their towering arrogance created a massive blind spot, rendering them incapable of seeing the federal trap closing tightly around them. Real power operates meticulously in the shadows. It requires the discipline to weight the intellect to map out the legal strategy and the nerve to strike only when the victory is absolute. Arrogance is a fragile glass house, and the undeniable truth is a heavy, unyielding stone. I survived the flood they engineered to drown me, and I built a multi-million-dollar empire on the high ground they could never reach. Thank you for listening to my journey today. If you have ever had to outsmart toxic individuals who severely underestimated your quiet strength, please share your experience in the comments below. Hit that like button and make sure to subscribe to Rabbit Revenge for more true stories of ultimate justice served ice cold. Never let anyone steal your foundation, because the dark is where the most devastating traps are laid.